I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A week alone in a remote cabin, deep in the woods, far from work, people, and all the noise of daily life. I wanted the silence, the stillness, just me, the trees, the wind, and maybe a few deer passing by. That was the plan, at least. The cabin belonged to an old friend who barely used it anymore. He warned me it was pretty isolated, no cell service, no running water, just a wood stove and a hand pump well outside. That was fine by me. I liked the idea of getting away from everything, even if it meant roughing it a little. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun already dipping low. The drive had taken longer than expected, winding up narrow dirt roads, past empty fields and thick woods, deeper and deeper into nowhere. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, the sky was streaked with orange and pink, shadows stretching long across the ground. The place was small but solid, built from thick logs with a slanted metal roof. A short wooden porch wrapped around the front, and a single window faced the trees. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded on all sides by dense forest. There was no driveway, just a patch of flattened grass where I parked my truck. I stepped out and stretched, taking in the cool evening air. The woods were quiet, just the occasional chirp of a bird or rustle of leaves. No traffic noise, no hum of electricity, just silence. Inside, the cabin smelled of dry wood and dust. A stone fireplace sat against one wall, stacked with logs. A small cot was pushed into the corner, covered in a thin, musty blanket. The only other furniture was a rough wooden table and a single chair. A few old pots and pans hung from nails on the wall. It was basic, but I didn't need much. I dropped my bag, set up a small lantern, and got to work unpacking. Food, a couple of books, my hunting knife, a flashlight, and an old .357 revolver my dad had given me years ago. I wasn't expecting trouble, but with no cell service and no one around for miles, it felt better to have it. By the time I got a fire going in the stove, the last light was fading. I ate a quick meal, sat on the porch for a while, then turned in early. The first night was peaceful. I woke a few times to the sound of the wind rattling the branches outside, but nothing more. Morning came slow and gray, mist hanging low over the trees. I made coffee on the wood stove and ate a simple breakfast, then headed out to explore. The forest was thick, mostly pine and oak with patches of underbrush. The ground was uneven, scattered with fallen logs and damp leaves. I hiked for a while, following a faint game trail, breathing in the cool air. I spotted a few deer tracks, some old scat, and what looked like the claw marks of a bear on the side of a tree. I knew there were black bears in the area. My friend had mentioned them, said they mostly kept their distance. Still, I made a mental note to be careful with my food. I hadn't seen any signs of fresh activity, so I didn't think much of it. By midday, I headed back to the cabin. I spent the afternoon splitting firewood and reading, then cooked a quick meal as the sun set. That night, the wind picked up. The trees groaned, branches creaking against each other. I sat by the fire for a while, listening, feeling the warmth seep into my bones. At some point, I heard something outside, a rustling, a slow, deliberate movement just beyond the porch. I froze, listening. The sound stopped, probably a deer, maybe a raccoon. Nothing to worry about. I shook it off, banked the fire, and went to bed. The next morning, I found the first sign that something wasn't right. The small wooden crate where I kept my food was knocked over. The lid had been pried open, the contents scattered. I had stored most of it inside, but a few cans and a bag of dried fruit had been left outside, and now they were gone. I checked the ground. Large tracks pressed deep into the dirt. Claw marks on the side of the porch. Bear. I cursed myself for being careless. I should have known better, should have locked everything up. I kicked myself for leaving food out, even for one night. I spent the morning securing my supplies, moved everything inside, triple-checked the doors and windows. I didn't want to take any chances. The day passed quietly. The air felt heavier, though, the silence less peaceful. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside made me sit up, ears straining. The next morning, I found more tracks, closer this time, leading up to the porch. The wood was scratched, deep gouges where something had dragged its claws. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. This wasn't normal. Black bears usually avoided people. They might sniff around if they smelled food, but they didn't linger. They didn't come back night after night. Something about this one was different. That day, I stayed close to the cabin, keeping my revolver within reach. I didn't see anything, but I could feel it. The forest felt different, like I wasn't alone. Night fell, and I locked the door, bolted the shutters. I sat by the fire, gun in my lap, listening. Hours passed. The wind howled. The trees swayed. Then, a heavy thud against the wall. I jumped, heart pounding. Another thud. Something big, moving just outside. I gripped the revolver, forcing myself to breathe. Then, a deep, heavy exhale. Right outside the window, the fire crackled. The wind roared. I stayed frozen, listening. Then came the sound of claws scraping against wood. Slow, deliberate. It was testing the cabin. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay calm. Then, a loud crash. The whole cabin shook. I bolted upright. The bear had slammed its weight against the door. The wood groaned but held. My mouth went dry. I cocked the revolver, heart hammering. Another crash, harder this time. The bear was trying to get in. I fired a shot through the door. The sound exploded through the cabin, ringing in my ears. Silence. For a long moment, nothing. Then, heavy footsteps. Retreating. I waited, barely breathing. Minutes passed. An hour. Finally, I exhaled, body shaking. Morning came slow. I stepped outside, revolver in hand. The porch was a mess. Deep claw marks, splintered wood, the door barely hanging onto its hinges. Tracks led back into the trees. I didn't wait around. I packed my gear, loaded my truck, and left. As I drove away, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. It stood there, quiet and empty, swallowed by the trees. I had come looking for solitude, but I had been watched, and I knew one thing for certain: that bear would be back. I was looking forward to the trip. A whole week in a cabin, surrounded by nothing but trees, fresh air, and silence. It had been a rough few months. Work had drained me, and city life felt suffocating. I needed a break. No emails, no phone calls, no people. Just me, nature, and a pile of books I'd been meaning to read for years. The cabin wasn't fancy, but that was part of the appeal. A simple wooden structure, tucked deep in the woods, far from any main road. I rented it from an older man who owned a few properties out here. He gave me a basic rundown. There was a generator for electricity, a gas stove, and a water pump out back. No Wi-Fi, no cell service. That was fine. That was what I wanted. I arrived in the late afternoon. The drive was long. The last few miles, nothing but a winding dirt path barely wide enough for my car. The trees stretched high on both sides, their branches thick and tangled, filtering the sunlight into dim streaks across the forest floor. It was beautiful, but there was something about it that felt heavy, like the woods had been there forever, watching, waiting. The cabin sat in a small clearing. A narrow porch wrapped around the front, and there was a single rocking chair sitting beside the door. The place looked old but sturdy, built for practicality, not comfort. The windows were small, the roof slightly slanted, and the wooden steps creaked under my weight as I carried my bags inside. Inside, it was just as simple. One main room with a small kitchen, a wood-burning stove, and a table with 2 chairs. A short hallway led to a bedroom and a bathroom. The air smelled of old wood and dust. I liked it. It felt separate from the rest of the world. Exactly what I needed. I spent the first couple of hours settling in. I unpacked my food, set up my sleeping bag on the bed, and checked the generator. Everything worked fine. The place was stocked with firewood, and there was an old radio sitting on the counter, probably the only form of entertainment here. By the time I stepped outside to get some fresh air, the sun was dipping below the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. It was quiet, not just regular quiet, deep, absolute silence. No wind, No rustling leaves, no birds, just stillness. I stood there for a moment, listening. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for, but the silence pressed in, heavy and unnatural. Then, from somewhere beyond the trees, there was a sound, a dull thump. I turned toward the noise, staring into the dense wall of trees. Nothing moved, probably a branch falling, maybe an animal. The woods were full of sounds, I told myself. I went back inside, shut the door, and locked it. The first night was uneventful. I made dinner, read a few chapters of a book, and turned in early. Sleep came easily, the kind that only happens when you're far from everything, with no city noise to interrupt it. I woke up just before sunrise, the cabin filled with the cold morning air. I pulled on a jacket and stepped outside. The sky was still dark, but the trees were outlined against it, black shapes stretching toward the sky. I could hear birds now, the normal morning sounds of the forest waking up. It was a relief. I made coffee, ate a quick breakfast, then decided to explore a bit. The trees were thick, but there was an old path leading away from the cabin, barely visible beneath layers of fallen leaves. I followed it, stepping carefully over roots and rocks. The deeper I went, the darker it got. Even in the morning light, the trees blocked most of the sun, turning the path into a tunnel of shadows. About half a mile in, I noticed something strange. The ground looked disturbed, like something heavy had been dragged through the dirt, cutting a faint but noticeable trail leading off into the trees. I stopped, staring at it. It didn't look like an animal track, too wide, too smooth. My first thought was that someone had come through here with a sled or something, but that didn't make sense. This was the middle of nowhere. I crouched down, touching the dirt. It was fresh. Something had been here. Recently, a branch snapped somewhere to my left. I stood up fast, heart pounding. The woods were silent again. I scanned the trees, looking for movement, but there was nothing. Just endless trunks, stretching out in every direction. I told myself it was probably a deer, but I suddenly had the urge to go back to the cabin. I walked quickly, my footsteps loud in the quiet. The whole way back, I felt like I was being watched. The second night was different. I was exhausted from hiking all day, but I couldn't sleep. The cabin felt too quiet. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. The wind had picked up, making the trees groan outside. I tried to focus on that, but beneath it, I thought I heard something else. Footsteps, soft, deliberate, moving just outside the cabin. I held my breath. The footsteps stopped. Then, a slow, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled through the dirt. The same sound I'd heard earlier in the woods. I sat up, every muscle tense. The noise stopped. I waited, listening, but it didn't come back. I barely slept after that. Morning came and I decided to leave early. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to find out. I packed my things quickly, trying to ignore the tight knot in my stomach. As I stepped outside, I stopped dead in my tracks. The ground in front of the cabin was disturbed. The dirt was uneven, dragged, like something or someone had been right there, just outside my door. I forced myself to move, throwing my bags into the car. My hands shook as I reached for the keys. Then something caught my eye. At the tree line, just beyond the clearing, something moved. I didn't wait. I started the car, slammed it into reverse, and tore down the dirt path, branches scraping against the sides as I sped toward the main road. I didn't look back. I drove straight home, not stopping until I was miles away. I never told anyone the full story. When people ask why I cut my trip short, I just say I didn't like the isolation. But I know the truth. Someone else was out there, and they were watching me. I never liked staying in unfamiliar places overnight, but when my cousin Jake invited me to his cabin deep in the woods for a long weekend, I convinced myself it would be a nice break. He had just finished fixing the place up after years of it sitting empty, and he wanted company for a few days. I figured some fresh air, fishing, and getting away from city noise wouldn't hurt. The cabin was about a 4-hour drive from where I lived, tucked in the middle of nowhere. No nearby towns, no stores, just miles of dirt roads and thick forest. By the time I pulled up, it was already late afternoon. The place looked solid, simple, small, built from thick logs with a slanted metal roof. The trees pressed in from all sides, and beyond them was nothing but rolling hills and more forest. I stepped out of my car, stretching my legs. The air was cooler here, filled with the scent of damp earth and pine. The only sound was the rustling of leaves as the wind moved through the trees. No distant hum of cars, no voices, just the woods. I grabbed my bag from the trunk and headed inside. The inside was cozy, wood-paneled walls, a stone fireplace, a small kitchenette, and 2 bedrooms with creaky wooden floors. Jake had stocked it with supplies: canned food, water, and even a rifle mounted over the fireplace. He'd said there were bears in the area, but they rarely came too close. I spent the first few hours settling in, checking out the cabin, unpacking, and looking around outside. There was a narrow trail leading down toward a small lake about a 5-minute walk away. I planned to check it out the next morning. As the sun set, the woods turned darker than I expected. No streetlights, no glow from distant buildings, just pitch-black trees stretching out in every direction. I sat on the porch for a while, listening. Crickets, wind, the occasional snap of a twig in the underbrush. Probably just a rabbit or deer moving through. I went inside, locked the door, and decided to get some sleep. The cabin had no electricity, just an old oil lantern and a couple of battery-powered lamps. I set one next to the bed, leaving it dimly lit, and crawled under the thick blankets. The mattress was stiff, and the sheets smelled faintly of wood smoke and dust. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. First, I wasn't sure why. The cabin was completely silent. Not even the wind was blowing anymore. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, listening. Then I heard it. A slow, deliberate crunch of leaves outside. It wasn't the quick, nervous movement of an animal. It was heavy, steady, like a person walking just beyond the cabin walls. I held my breath, listening. The steps moved around the side of the cabin, then stopped near the front porch. I reached for my phone to check the time. 2:34 a.m. No service. For a long minute, nothing happened. Then I heard the soft, unmistakable sound of wood creaking. The porch. I stayed completely still, every muscle in my body tensed. The sound didn't come again. No knocking, no rattling of the door handle. Just silence. I don't know how long I lay there, but eventually exhaustion won. I must have drifted back to sleep because the next thing I knew, the dim morning light was filtering through the window. Everything was still. I sat up slowly, listening. No footsteps, no sounds outside, just birds chirping in the trees. I got out of bed and walked to the door, hesitating for a moment before unlocking it and stepping onto the porch. The ground was damp with morning dew. I looked around, scanning the trees, the narrow dirt path leading into the woods. That's when I saw them. Footprints in the dirt. They weren't from a bear or any animal. They were from boots. Large, deep impressions, circling the cabin once before stopping right in front of the door. I stood there for a long time, staring. Whoever had been out here had been standing just inches away from where I slept. Watching. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe a hunter passing through, curious about the cabin. But no hunter would walk right up to someone's door in the middle of the night and just stand there. I shook it off and went about my day. I hiked down to the lake, fished for a while, and spent the afternoon chopping firewood. I kept the rifle close, though, leaning it against the porch, just in case. That night, I locked the door tighter, shoved a chair under the handle, and kept the rifle next to my bed. Sleep came in short, uneasy stretches. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind against the walls set my nerves on edge. Then, just past 3 a.m., I heard something else. A long, slow drag of something heavy being pulled through the dirt. I sat up immediately, gripping the rifle, my heart hammering. The sound came from behind the cabin, moving toward the trees. It wasn't footsteps. It was something being dragged. I forced myself to move, creeping to the window. The glass was old and dirty, but I could just make out the shape of something dark moving along the tree line. A figure, not an animal, person. They were pulling something behind them, but I couldn't tell what. A bag? A tarp? The sound of weight shifting against the dirt sent chills down my spine. Then, as if sensing me watching, the figure stopped. For a second, nothing moved. Then the head turned slightly toward the cabin. Toward me. I dropped to the floor, heart pounding. I didn't dare look again. The dragging sound started up once more, moving deeper into the woods until it finally faded into nothing. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed awake, gripping the rifle, waiting for the first sign of daylight. As soon as the sun rose, I packed my things. I didn't care about the weekend trip anymore. I needed to get out of there. I stepped onto the porch and glanced toward the tree line. The dirt near the edge of the woods was disturbed, like something heavy had been dragged through. The footprints from the night before were still there, mixed with newer ones leading away. I didn't follow them. I didn't want to know. I got in my car, started the engine, and drove. The tires kicked up dust as I sped down the narrow road, not looking back. It wasn't until I reached the highway miles away that I finally felt like I could breathe again. I never told Jake exactly what happened. I just said the trip wasn't for me. A few months later, he mentioned that someone had broken into the cabin. The door was wide open when he arrived, and inside, the place was trashed. Furniture overturned, the mattress sliced open. Nothing was stolen. Whoever had been there hadn't been looking for valuables. I haven't been back since. I don't know what I expected when I agreed to spend a weekend alone at my uncle's cabin. I had been there plenty of times as a kid, back when my family would make summer trips out to the mountains. It never felt remote back then. I guess when you're a kid, you don't notice how far you are from civilization as long as there are enough people around. But now, driving up that winding dirt road in the late afternoon, it was impossible to ignore. The place sat deep in the woods, tucked miles away from any town. There was no cell service, no Wi-Fi, and the only connection to the outside world was an old landline in the kitchen, which I wasn't even sure still worked. My uncle had bought the place years ago as a hunting retreat, but since his health had started declining, it had been sitting empty most of the year. He wanted me to check in on it, stay for the weekend, make sure nothing was falling apart or taken over by critters. I figured it'd be a peaceful getaway. No distractions, just me, the fresh air, and maybe a few hikes. I had no idea how wrong I was. The cabin itself was a sturdy, one-story structure with a wraparound porch, built solidly from thick logs. It had a tin roof that rattled under the wind, but otherwise it seemed in good shape. As I pulled up and cut the engine, the silence settled over me like a heavy blanket. No cars, no voices, just the distant rustle of wind through the trees. I stepped out of the truck, gravel crunching under my boots. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. Unlocking the front door took some effort. The wood had swelled slightly from the last rain, but after a few solid pushes, it gave way. Inside, the place was just as I remembered. Rustic, cluttered with old hunting gear and framed photos of my uncle's past trips. The living room had a stone fireplace, a weathered couch, and a thick wooden coffee table covered in dust. I spent the first hour unloading my gear and checking the essentials. The generator hummed to life on the first try. The lights flickered but stayed on. The kitchen had a small gas stove and an old fridge that took a while to cool down. I had packed enough food and water for 3 days, not expecting to have to rely on anything here. Everything seemed normal, until the sun started to set. I had just finished eating when I noticed it, the feeling that something was off. At first, it was just a vague unease, the kind that creeps up when you're alone in a strange place. I shook it off, telling myself I was just adjusting to the quiet. But then I stepped out onto the porch for some fresh air, and that's when I saw them. Footprints, fresh ones. They trailed from the edge of the woods to the porch steps, half dried in the dirt. My stomach tightened. They weren't mine. I had been inside for the past hour, and these were new. The size told me they belonged to a man, bigger than me, and the way they were spaced suggested a slow, deliberate walk toward the cabin. I scanned the tree line, but the forest was nothing but shifting shadows in the fading light. I told myself it could have been anything, a hiker, maybe, or a hunter passing through. But deep down, I knew that wasn't likely. This land belonged to my uncle. No one should have been here. Still, I forced myself to stay calm. I locked the door and double-checked the windows. The cabin had thick walls, strong locks. Whatever was out there, I was safe inside. Or so I thought. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the old wood, every gust of wind against the roof made my pulse jump. Around midnight, I thought I heard something moving outside. Slow, deliberate steps circling the cabin. I held my breath, listening. Then silence. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted into a restless sleep. But when I woke up the next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. More footprints. This time, they weren't just on the ground. They were on the porch, and they weren't coming toward the cabin. They were leading away. Someone had stood at my door, watching. I wanted to leave. Every instinct in me screamed to get the hell out. But I forced myself to think logically. Whoever it was hadn't tried to break in. Maybe they were just curious. Maybe it was some local checking to see if the cabin was occupied. No, I couldn't lie to myself. I had to be careful. I spent the morning scouting around the cabin, looking for any signs of who it might have been. The footprints led back into the woods, disappearing into the dense undergrowth. No signs of a campsite, no tracks leading to a road, just someone who had come in the night and left before dawn. I kept my pistol on me after that. The rest of the day was uneventful. I busied myself with chores, clearing leaves from the gutters, checking for leaks, anything to keep my mind from the unease crawling under my skin. By evening, I had almost convinced myself it was nothing. Almost. Then the second night came. I don't know what woke me up. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was some faint noise I didn't fully register. But when my eyes opened, I knew something was wrong. The room was pitch black, the only light coming from the dying embers in the fireplace. I held still, barely breathing. And then, a sound. Soft. A shuffle. Inside the cabin. My chest tightened. My hand crept toward my pistol on the nightstand. I strained to listen. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. The silence stretched. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, gripping the gun so tightly my fingers ached. Eventually, exhaustion won. I told myself I imagined it. I had to be imagining it. Morning came slow, and when I finally worked up the courage to check the cabin, I found the back door. Unlocked. Not broken. Not forced. Just unlocked. I know I locked it. I know I did. I left that morning. I packed my things, threw them into the truck, and didn't look back. The whole drive down the mountain, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the road behind me. But I never did. When I finally got back to town, I called my uncle. I told him what happened. He listened, quiet, then sighed. "You're not the first." That's all he said. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know. I always liked the idea of being alone in the woods. Something about the quiet, the lack of people, the slow pace. It all made sense to me. The cabin was supposed to be a retreat, a break from the world, a place where I could think without distraction. I never thought of it as dangerous. I never thought I would feel fear in a place like that. I found the cabin online, an old listing that had been sitting for years. The price was low, almost suspiciously so, but I wasn't looking for something fancy. Just a small, isolated place where I could go for a while, away from everything. The pictures showed a single-room cabin with a loft, a wood stove, and a small porch that overlooked a dense tree line. It was about a mile from the nearest dirt road, completely cut off from anything resembling civilization. Perfect. The first time I visited, I knew it was exactly what I wanted. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the birds and the wind moving through the trees. The cabin was even smaller than I expected, Just one open space with a ladder leading to the loft where a thin mattress was shoved into the corner. No electricity, no plumbing, just a well out back and an outhouse that was half rotted but still standing. Felt like mine. I moved in at the start of fall. I brought enough supplies to last a couple of months. Canned food, rice, dried beans, a few jugs of water in case the well was bad. I had a rifle mostly for hunting, but I wasn't expecting to use it much. I also brought a heavy lock for the door. It seemed unnecessary, but I liked the idea of being able to shut the world out completely. At first, everything was normal. I spent my days gathering wood, reading, hiking. The days were short, and the nights were long. But I liked the way the darkness wrapped around the cabin, the way the firelight flickered against the wooden walls. It was peaceful. Then, things started to feel off. It was small at first, the feeling that someone had been near the cabin while I was out. I would come back from a long walk and feel like something had changed, like an object had shifted slightly or the air inside had a different weight to it. But there was never anything obvious. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing missing. One afternoon, I found something strange near the tree line. A single boot print, half smudged in the dirt. It wasn't mine. My boots had a different tread. I told myself it was old, that maybe a hunter had passed through before I moved in. But it looked fresh. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, before finally turning back to the cabin. That night, I locked the door earlier than usual. A few days later, I woke up to find the cabin's door slightly open, just an inch or two, enough for a sliver of cold air to slip through. I stared at it from the loft, heart pounding, listening to the silence outside. I told myself I had forgotten to lock it, even though I knew I had. The lock was still in place, the latch unbroken, but the door was open. I got up, closed it, and pushed a chair against it for good measure. From that point on, the unease grew. I started noticing little things. Scratches on the wood near the windows, as if something had been dragged lightly across the surface. Twigs arranged in odd patterns near the front steps. Small piles of rocks that hadn't been there before. I would hear sounds in the woods at night. Branches snapping, leaves crunching, footsteps stopping just before I could be sure they were real. The worst was the feeling, the constant, skin-crawling sensation of being watched. I started keeping the rifle close. I would sit up late, staring out the small window, waiting to catch movement. But the woods stayed still. The trees stood silent. One evening, just as the sun was setting, I went to fetch water from the well. The air was colder than usual, thick with the damp smell of approaching winter. As I pulled the bucket up, I felt it again. That weight in the air, the undeniable certainty that someone was watching me. I turned slowly, scanning the tree line. Nothing. I stood there for a long time, listening. The woods were silent. No birds, no wind, no distant rustling of small animals. Just stillness. I swallowed hard, grabbed the bucket, and walked back to the cabin, trying not to look over my shoulder. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made my muscles tighten. Every creak of the wood, every shift of the wind, sent my heart pounding. At some point, exhaustion won. I woke to the sound of something tapping against the window. My body went rigid. Tap, tap, tap. Slow, deliberate. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My mind screamed at me to stay still. The tapping stopped. Then came the sound of something shifting just outside the door. The creak of wood under careful, shifting weight. Someone was standing on the porch. I reached for the rifle with shaking hands, pulling it close as I sat up. I strained to hear, my heart pounding so hard I could barely make out anything over it. Silence. I stayed like that until the first light of dawn crept through the window. When I finally worked up the courage to move, I climbed down the ladder as quietly as possible, rifle gripped tight. The door was still locked. The chair was still pushed against it. But outside, in the damp earth just beyond the porch, were footprints. Bare feet. I packed my things that morning. I stuffed my bag as full as it could get, barely stopping to eat. I was done. The hike back to the road felt like it took hours. Every step, I expected to hear footsteps behind me. Every gust of wind made me flinch, but I never saw anyone. When I finally reached my truck, I didn't look back. I got in, locked the doors, and drove without stopping. I never went back. I never tried to figure out who it was. Some things aren't worth knowing. I don't know why I agreed to the trip. Maybe it was the way my coworker had framed it. A free cabin for the weekend, total solitude, no phone service, no stress. After the past few months at work, that sounded like exactly what I needed. I wasn't much of an outdoorsman, but I liked the idea of peace and quiet. A few days away from emails and meetings. Just me, the snow, and nothing else. I should have asked more questions. The drive took longer than expected. It was supposed to be about 4 hours into the mountains, but the roads got worse the higher I went. Snow piled up along the edges, the plows barely keeping up. The sun was already low when I turned off the main road and onto the unpaved path leading to the cabin. It was narrower than I expected, barely wide enough for my SUV. The trees pressed in close on both sides, heavy with snow, their branches forming a tunnel. After a few minutes, I reached a clearing. The cabin sat at the far end, a simple wooden structure with a sloped roof and a covered porch. A chimney poked out from the top, and there was a pile of firewood stacked neatly against the side. The driveway was a mess of snow and ice, so I parked just before it and decided I'd move the car later. The air was cold when I stepped out, bitter, sharp. I could hear the wind moving through the trees, a steady whispering sound. The place looked empty, untouched, just what I needed. Inside, the cabin was small but comfortable. A wood-burning stove stood in one corner, a couch and a chair in another. There was a small kitchen area, a dining table, and a single bedroom in the back. It smelled like old wood and dust, but it wasn't unpleasant. There was even a stack of canned food in the cupboards, just as my coworker had promised. No need to go back into town. I dropped my bag in the bedroom, got the fire going, and settled in. That night, I woke up cold. The fire had burned down to embers, barely glowing in the dark. I could hear the wind outside, stronger now, pressing against the walls. The room felt different, like the air had changed, heavier. I sat up, rubbing my arms for warmth, and listened. There was nothing at first, just the wind, the faint creak of the cabin settling. Then, a sound, faint, almost lost in the wind, a scraping noise. I held my breath. The sound came again, soft, slow, like something brushing against the outside of the cabin. I told myself it was a tree branch. The wind had probably blown some snow loose. Still, I got up, walked to the front window, and looked outside. The porch was empty. The snow-covered ground was untouched. But the feeling didn't go away. That weight in the air, a stillness, like something was just out of sight, waiting. I shook it off, threw another log on the fire, and went back to bed. The next morning, I found tracks. They started near the tree line, just beyond where my car was parked. At first, I thought they were animal tracks, maybe a deer or something. But when I looked closer, they were wrong. They weren't hoof prints. They weren't paw prints. They were barefoot. Bare human footprints deep in the snow. I stared at them for a long time, my breath coming out in thick white clouds. The tracks led from the trees, moved toward the cabin, then circled around to the back. I followed them carefully, my boots crunching in the snow. Around the back of the cabin, the tracks stopped beneath the bedroom window. Right below where I had been sleeping, a pit opened in my stomach. I looked at the prints again, trying to convince myself they were old, that someone had been here before the last snowfall. But I knew that wasn't true. They were fresh, and whoever had made them wasn't wearing shoes. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and I suddenly felt exposed. I turned quickly, scanning the woods, but there was nothing. Just endless white and dark tree trunks stretching into the distance. I forced myself to take a deep breath and went back inside. The day passed slowly. I kept telling myself I was overreacting. Maybe some hiker had gotten lost. Maybe I was misreading the tracks. I distracted myself by chopping firewood, making food, keeping the stove going. By the time night fell, I almost believed my own excuses. Almost. The wind picked up again after dark. Stronger this time, rattling the windows and pushing against the walls. The fire crackled, casting long shadows across the cabin. I tried to sleep, but I kept listening. Then, sometime in the night, the scraping came back. I shot upright in bed. It was closer this time, deliberate, a slow, dragging sound moving along the wall. I sat perfectly still, my pulse hammering in my throat. Then, a soft thud against the door. Not a knock, something heavier, softer. Couldn't breathe. Another thud, then silence. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, listening to nothing but my own heartbeat. Eventually, the fire burned low, and exhaustion won out. I don't remember falling asleep. At dawn, I found more tracks. They were closer this time, circling the cabin, stopping at the windows. The snow was disturbed near the door, like something had stood there for a long time. I needed to leave. I packed quickly, throwing everything into my bag. When I stepped outside, the cold hit me like a slap. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie stillness. I moved toward my car, then stopped. The driver's side door was open. I knew I had locked it. The inside was coated in a thin layer of snow. The seat was wet, soaked through. My keys were still in the ignition. The engine wouldn't start. The battery was dead. A fresh set of footprints, barefoot, led from the car back toward the woods. I wasn't alone. I grabbed my bag and started walking. The nearest town was miles away, but I didn't care. I wasn't staying. I didn't look back, not even when I heard the soft crunch of snow behind me. I never believed in things like dogmen. I heard the stories, of course, just like everyone else who spends time in the woods. Tall tales passed around by hunters, campers, and old-timers who swore they'd seen something that wasn't quite right. I always figured it was just bears, shadows, or the mind playing tricks in the dark. But after what happened to me at my uncle's old hunting cabin, I don't doubt anymore. It was late September when I decided to take the trip. The air had a bite to it, the trees turning red and gold, leaves crunching underfoot. My uncle had passed a few years back, and the family still owned his cabin deep in the woods of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. It had been sitting empty for years, and I figured I'd spend a week there, hunting, fishing, and getting some peace away from town. The drive out was uneventful. Long stretches of empty highway, then miles of dirt roads cutting through thick forest. The kind of place where cell service is spotty at best. The cabin itself was nothing special. A one-room structure with a small loft, an old wood stove, and a front porch that overlooked a clearing. It had no running water or electricity, just an outhouse a few yards back and a well with a hand pump. I got there late in the afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. The first thing I did was walk the perimeter, making sure everything looked intact. The door was still locked, windows unbroken. There were no signs of animals getting in. The forest around me was quiet, too quiet, maybe, but I chalked it up to the time of day. Inside, the place smelled like dust and old wood. I opened some windows to air it out while I brought in my supplies. I had enough food to last a week, a rifle for hunting, and a flashlight with extra batteries. I kept things simple, just enough to be comfortable, but not so much that I'd have to haul a bunch of stuff back when I left. That first night was uneventful. I made a small fire in the stove, cooked some canned chili, and sat on the porch with a beer. The woods stretched out in every direction, endless and dark. The wind whispered through the trees, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called. I turned in early, climbing into my sleeping bag in the loft. The cabin creaked with the wind, the old wood settling. It was the kind of quiet that made your ears ring, and I lay there for a long time listening. Eventually, I drifted off. Sometime in the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The cabin was still, the fire in the stove reduced to embers. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting. Then I heard it, a rustling outside. Something moving in the brush just beyond the clearing. I told myself it was just a deer, maybe a raccoon, but I didn't like how heavy the movement sounded. Slow, deliberate, not like an animal just passing through. I sat up, listening harder. The The sound stopped. For a long time, I didn't hear anything else. Just the wind. Then, just as I was about to lay back down, there was a new noise. Closer. A sniffing sound. It was right outside the cabin. I stayed perfectly still, my heart hammering. The sniffing moved along the wall, slow and deep, like whatever was out there was scenting the air, searching for something. Then scratching. Not loud, not aggressive, just the soft scrape of nails against wood, near the door. I reached for my rifle, barely breathing. The sound stopped again. I waited, listening so hard my ears ached. Minutes passed. Then, finally, I heard it moving away. Slow footsteps fading into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the loft, rifle across my lap, waiting for the first hint of dawn. When the sun finally rose, I climbed down and stepped outside. The air was crisp, the grass wet with dew. Birds were chirping, the normal morning sounds returning. It made me feel a little foolish for how on edge I'd been. Then I saw the tracks. They were deep, pressed into the soft earth near the door. Large. Too large for a wolf. Bigger than any dog I'd ever seen. The shape was wrong, too. The front part looked like a paw, but the back had an elongated, almost human-like structure. I crouched down, running my fingers through the dirt. 5 toes. Claws. A shiver ran through me. I tried to reason it away, maybe a bear with a deformed foot. Maybe 2 overlapping prints. But deep down, I knew better. I spent the day out in the woods, hunting, trying to shake the unease. But I couldn't stop thinking about the tracks. About the sound of something sniffing at my door in the middle of the night. That evening, I double-checked the locks before I started my fire. The sense of being watched clung to me, a constant weight at the back of my mind. That night, the sound came again. I was ready this time, my rifle in my hands before I even sat up. The sniffing was back, slow and methodical, moving around the cabin. Then came the scratching. This time it was harder, more insistent. I crept to the window, careful not to make a sound, and peered outside. The moon was bright, casting long shadows across the clearing. That's when I saw it. A shape, crouched low near the porch steps. At first, my brain refused to understand what I was seeing. It was covered in dark, coarse fur, but its limbs were wrong. Too long, too lean. The head was massive, ears pointed, snout elongated. Then it lifted its head, and I saw its eyes. They reflected the moonlight, yellow and intelligent. Not the vacant stare of an animal, but something more, something aware. I raised my rifle, but before I could even steady my aim, it moved. Not away. It leapt onto the porch in a single, fluid motion, its claws clicking against the wood. I stumbled back, my breath coming fast. Then it let out a sound. A low, guttural growl that rose into something between a howl and a snarl. The sheer force of it vibrated in my chest. I fired. The shot shattered the night, echoing through the trees. The creature jerked but didn't drop. Instead, it spun and bolted, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't sleep after that. I kept my rifle in my hands, jumping at every creak of the cabin. At dawn, I packed my things. I didn't waste time. I threw everything into my truck, checking over my shoulder the entire time. The woods felt different, too quiet, the usual morning birdsong absent. When I finally started down the dirt road, I forced myself not to look back. But as I rounded the last bend before hitting the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and there it was, standing at the tree line, watching me go. It didn't chase me. It didn't move at all. Just stood there, its yellow eyes locked onto mine until the road curved and I lost sight of it. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know if it still stands, and I don't want to know. The cabin was an old one. It had belonged to my uncle for as long as I could remember, sitting way back in the woods, past a gravel road that didn't see much use anymore. He used to hunt out here when he was younger, but by the time I was old enough to visit, he had mostly stopped. He still came out a few times a year, though, just to check on the place and make sure it wasn't falling apart. When he offered to let me stay there for a long weekend, I jumped at the chance. I had been feeling burned out, too much noise, too many people, too much everything. A few days alone in the woods sounded perfect. The drive up was uneventful. The farther I got from town, the worse the roads became, narrow and cracked, with trees leaning over them like they were trying to swallow the whole thing back into the forest. By the time I reached the turnoff, it was just a single dirt path, barely visible between the trees. The cabin wasn't much to look at, just a one-room structure with a tin roof, a wood stove, and a few mismatched pieces of furniture. It smelled like old wood and dust. There was a small creek a short walk away and plenty of firewood stacked outside. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just the woods and the wind and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. The first day passed quietly. I walked the trails behind the cabin, took some pictures, and sat by the creek for a while. It was peaceful in a way I had forgotten life could be. That night, I built a fire outside and cooked some food, listening to the sounds of the forest around me. Frogs, crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, and then I saw the dog. At first, it was just a shape between the trees, low to the ground, watching me from the darkness. I wouldn't have even noticed it if not for the way the firelight caught its eyes. They reflected back in a strange way, too bright, almost white instead of the usual yellow or green you'd expect from an animal's eyes at night. It was a big dog, bigger than any I had seen in a long time. Its fur was patchy, thin in some places, almost mangy looking. I whistled softly, just out of habit, but the dog didn't move. It just stared. I figured it had to belong to someone, maybe a hunter nearby, or a stray that had been living off whatever it could catch. I didn't have anything to offer it, so I ignored it and went inside for the night. That was the first mistake. The next morning, the dog was still there. It was sitting in the exact same spot, just past the tree line. It hadn't moved an inch. I tried to get a better look at it in the daylight. Its fur was a mix of dark brown and black, with patches of lighter skin showing through where it was too thin. It had long legs, longer than seemed right for its body, and its ribs were just barely visible beneath its coat. I didn't like the way it looked at me. Most dogs, even strays, will react when you move, ears twitching, head tilting, something. But this one just stared. I decided not to pay it any more attention. If it was a stray, it would leave when it got bored. If it belonged to someone, they'd probably come looking for it. I spent most of the day hiking, wandering farther than I probably should have. I followed the creek for a while, stepping over fallen logs and ducking under low-hanging branches. The deeper I went, the quieter the woods seemed to get. Around mid-afternoon, I got the feeling I was being watched. It wasn't the same as before. This wasn't just a weird dog staring at me from the tree-line. This was something else, something deeper, like the whole forest had gone still and was holding its breath. I turned around and headed back. That night, the dog was closer. It was sitting about 10 feet from the cabin door now, still watching, still not moving. I could see its chest rising and falling, slow and steady, but otherwise it was like a statue. I didn't go outside. I locked the door, closed the curtains, and sat by the stove, listening. I heard it moving after a while. A soft scrape of claws on wood, the faintest sound of breathing just outside the window. I barely slept. The next morning, the dog was gone. There were tracks in the dirt outside, circling the cabin, but no sign of it anywhere. I was relieved at first. Maybe it had finally lost interest. Then I noticed the footprints. Among the paw prints in the dirt, there were others. Bare feet, human. They circled the cabin the same way the dog's tracks did, overlapping in places, sometimes following the exact same path. I didn't go hiking that day. I stayed close to the cabin, gathering firewood, keeping busy, trying not to let my mind run wild. The tracks could have been from a hunter, maybe some local who liked walking barefoot. Weird, but not impossible. That night I heard it again. The breathing, slow, heavy, right outside the window. I didn't move. I barely even breathed. The sound stayed there for what felt like hours. Then slowly it moved, circling the cabin just like before. A soft scrape of claws on wood. A creak on the porch. Something brushed against the door. I stayed awake until dawn. When the sun finally rose, I packed my things. I didn't care if I was cutting the trip short. I didn't care if I looked stupid. Something was wrong here. I opened the door slowly, heart pounding, half expecting something to be standing there. But there was nothing, just empty woods and morning light. Then I saw the footprints again, not just circling the cabin this time. They led away down the trail back toward the road. I followed them without thinking, moving quickly, almost jogging. They stayed on the path for a while, then veered off into the trees. That's when I saw it. Not the dog, not a person. The shape was wrong. Low to the ground, long limbs, too thin. It moved fast, faster than anything that size should have, disappearing between the trees before I could get a clear look. I didn't stop to think. I ran. I ran all the way back to my car, throwing my bag in the back seat, slamming the door shut behind me. I didn't look back. I don't know what I saw in those woods. I don't want to know. I never went back to that cabin. My uncle still owns it, still checks on it a few times a year. He says nothing's ever seemed strange to him. But every once in a while, he mentions finding tracks in the dirt. Not just paw prints, bare feet. I should have known something was wrong with the place the moment I pulled up. The cabin stood alone in a deep valley, surrounded by thick trees, the kind that blocked out the sun even in the middle of the day. The gravel road leading to it was narrow and uneven, barely wide enough for my truck. It had taken me nearly an hour to get there from the main highway, bouncing over potholes and dodging fallen branches. By the time I arrived, my back ached from the rough ride. I stepped out of my truck and took in my surroundings. The cabin itself was small but sturdy, made of old, weathered logs with a tin roof that looked like it had seen better days. The front porch sagged slightly, and the single window facing the driveway had a crack running diagonally across the glass. The air was still, heavy with the scent of damp wood and decaying leaves. There were no sounds of birds or insects, just the faint rustling of branches swaying in the wind. I had rented the place for the week. The listing had described it as a peaceful escape deep in the wilderness, perfect for anyone looking to disconnect from the world. That's exactly what I wanted. A break from the constant stress of work, the noise of the city, and the feeling that I was always running on empty. No phone service, no internet, just me and the quiet. I grabbed my duffel bag from the back seat and stepped onto the porch. The wood creaked under my weight. When I reached for the doorknob, I hesitated for a second, a weird feeling creeping into my chest. The air felt thick, like the kind of pressure you feel before a thunderstorm. I shook it off, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The inside of the cabin was basic, just a small living space with a couch, a wood-burning stove, and a tiny kitchenette. A short hallway led to the bedroom and a bathroom. Everything was clean but old. The wooden floors had deep grooves worn into them, and the furniture looked like it hadn't been replaced in decades. There was no TV, no radio, just a stack of firewood by the stove and a single oil lamp on the coffee table. I set my bag down and took a deep breath. The place smelled like dust and pine. It wasn't much, but it would do. The first day passed without anything unusual happening. I spent most of it outside, hiking along the nearby trails and getting familiar with the area. The valley was beautiful in a rugged, untouched kind of way. The trees were tall and thick, their branches intertwining overhead like a canopy. The ground was covered in a thick layer of moss, soft underfoot, and the only sounds were the occasional chirping of birds and the distant rush of a river. By the time the sun started to set, I was exhausted. I made a simple dinner, canned chili and some crackers before settling into bed. The silence was almost unsettling. No distant hum of traffic, no neighbors, just the sound of the wind pushing through the trees. It took me a while to fall asleep, but when I did, it was deep and dreamless. That changed on the second night. I woke up sometime after midnight, my throat dry, my body stiff. I lay still for a moment, listening. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it, a soft, deliberate crunching sound. Footsteps. I sat up slowly, my heart thudding in my chest. The sound was faint but distinct, moving just outside the cabin, near the porch. I reached for the flashlight I had left on the nightstand and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, casting long shadows across the room. I hesitated before getting out of bed. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to just pull the blankets over my head and pretend I hadn't heard anything. But I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep if I didn't check. I moved quietly to the front door and pressed my ear against it. Silence. I turned the handle slowly, trying not to make any noise, and pulled the door open just enough to peek outside. The porch was empty. I stepped out, the cold air biting against my skin. My flashlight beam swept across the trees, the gravel driveway, the edge of the woods. Nothing. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, something foraging in the night. But deep down, I wasn't convinced. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat on the couch for a while, listening. The only sound was the faint ticking of my wristwatch. Eventually, I forced myself to go back to bed. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach turn. Just outside the porch in the dirt were footprints. Not animal tracks, human footprints. Bare feet. The prints were deep, clear in the damp earth, and they led from the tree-line to the porch. I stared at them for a long time, my mind struggling to make sense of it. Had someone been watching me? I glanced around, scanning the woods for any sign of movement, but the trees stood still, their branches swaying gently in the wind. I told myself it was probably a hiker, maybe someone lost who had wandered onto the property. But that didn't explain why they were barefoot. I spent the rest of the day trying to shake off the unease. I went for another hike, stayed out longer than I had planned, anything to keep myself from thinking about the footprints. But as the sun started to dip below the horizon, that familiar sense of unease crept back in. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the trees outside made my pulse spike. But nothing happened. No footsteps, no noises, nothing. By the time the sun rose, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed up my bag and stepped outside. The morning air was crisp, the sky a soft, pale blue. I took one last look at the cabin before heading to my truck. Then I saw them. New footprints, fresh, leading from the trees to the cabin and then back into the woods. I didn't wait. I threw my bag in the truck, climbed in, and started the engine. Gravel crunched under the tires as I pulled out onto the road, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Just for a second, I saw something standing at the edge of the trees. A figure, barefoot, watching me leave. I didn't look again. I just kept driving, the cabin disappearing behind me, swallowed by the trees. I never went back, never contacted the owner. I left the keys in the glove box and never looked at the listing again. I don't know who or what was out there, but I do know one thing. I wasn't alone in that valley, and whoever was out there didn't want me to leave. But they didn't stop me, and I never gave them another chance. I don't think I've been back to that place in over 15 years. Even now, as I write this, I can picture it clearly. The way the wooden walls smelled of damp pine and old dust. The way the floor creaked in that uneven, groaning way when you stepped in just the right spots. My great-grandpa's cabin wasn't some cozy, postcard-perfect retreat in the woods. It was old, isolated, and more than anything, deeply unsettling in a way I could never quite explain. I was 12 the last time I stayed there. My dad had driven me up for a weekend of fishing and toughening up, as he liked to call it. The drive was long, two-lane roads winding through miles of thick trees, the kind of forest that looks the same no matter how far you go. We didn't pass many houses, just the occasional rusty mailbox at the end of a gravel path, the kind of places that looked abandoned even when they weren't. When we finally pulled onto the dirt road leading to the cabin, I remember feeling that first prick of unease. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by dense, overgrown woods. The trees were massive, their branches tangling together to block out most of the sunlight. The clearing itself was a patch of rough, uneven ground with more weeds than grass, and the cabin stood right in the middle of it, squatting like some tired old beast. The logs that made up its walls were dark with age. The roof sagged slightly in one corner, and the front porch leaned just enough to make you feel like it might give out under your weight. I knew my great-grandpa had built it himself back in the 40s. I also knew that after he died, no one in the family really used it anymore, except for the occasional hunting trip. But my dad had always liked the place, so he brought me there whenever he could. That evening was uneventful. We unpacked, set up our cots, and ate dinner by lantern light. The cabin had no electricity, just an old wood stove, a few kerosene lamps, and a well out back for water. The bathroom was an outhouse a little ways into the woods. It was just the two of us, and as the sun dipped below the trees, the temperature dropped fast. The cabin held onto the day's heat for a while, but by nightfall, the air inside was damp and cold. I remember lying on my cot, listening to the night sounds outside. Wind through the trees, the occasional hoot of an owl, the distant rustling of small animals moving through the underbrush. The forest was alive in a way that felt different from being in town. It wasn't just background noise. It was constant, shifting, unpredictable. Then, at some point in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had pulled me out of sleep. The cabin was pitch black, the kind of darkness that presses against your eyes even when they're open. The fire in the wood stove had died down to embers, casting faint, flickering shadows on the ceiling. My dad's cot was across the room, and I could hear his slow, steady breathing. Then I heard it, a creak, not loud, not sudden, just the soft, almost hesitant sound of wood shifting under weight, came from the front porch. Lying there, completely still, I strained to listen. First, there was nothing, just the usual forest noises, the whisper of wind through the trees. But then, another creak. My skin went cold. I wanted to tell myself it was just the wind, just the cabin settling. But the sound was deliberate, slow, like someone was stepping carefully, testing each board before shifting their weight. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensed. The cabin had no locks. The door was just a heavy wooden slab with an old metal latch. If someone was out there was nothing stopping them from coming inside. Another creak, closer now. I turned my head just slightly, trying to see the door through the dark. The lantern was on the table near my dad's cot, but I was too scared to move. My heartbeat was loud in my ears. My hands clenched so tight my nails dug into my palms. Then silence. For what felt like forever, I lay there waiting, listening. The sounds outside continued as they always had. Wind, leaves, the occasional rustling in the underbrush. But whoever or whatever had been on the porch was gone. I don't know how long I stayed awake after that, but eventually, exhaustion won. When I woke up the next morning, sunlight was streaming through the cracks in the log walls, and everything felt normal again. My dad was already outside, chopping wood. When I stepped onto the porch, the old boards creaked beneath my weight, the same sound I'd heard in the night. I wanted to say something, to ask if he'd heard anything, but I didn't. Maybe because I was afraid he'd laugh at me. Maybe because I didn't really want to know the answer. We spent the rest of the day fishing at the lake a few miles away. By the time we got back, the sun was already dipping below the trees, and the air had that cool, damp bite to it again. My dad made dinner while I sat on the porch, staring out at the tree line. And that's when I saw it. Something was standing just inside the trees. I couldn't make out any details. Just a tall, dark shape, half hidden in the shadows. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. I felt my stomach clench. My first instinct was to call for my dad, but something stopped me. Some deep, instinctive part of me knew that if I acknowledged it, if I reacted, it would be worse. So I just sat there, staring back. I don't know how long we stayed like that. A minute? 5? But then, as if it had never been there at all, the shape turned and melted back into the trees. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that dark shape standing at the edge of the woods. The next morning, my dad woke me up early. We were leaving. He didn't say why, just that we had to pack up. I didn't argue. As we loaded up the truck, I glanced toward the trees one last time, half expecting to see that figure still standing there. But there was nothing, just the forest, quiet and still. We never went back to that cabin. I never asked my dad why we left so suddenly, and he never offered an explanation. But I think he saw it too. I arrived at the cabin just before sundown. The drive had been long, winding through endless dirt roads that cut deep into the forest. By the time I pulled up to the clearing, my back ached from sitting too long, and my eyes burned from staring at the road. The cabin was small, built of dark, weathered wood, with a slanted tin roof and a front porch that sagged slightly in the middle. The forest pressed in close on all sides, towering pines casting long shadows across the clearing. I killed the engine and sat for a moment, taking in the silence. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, no houses nearby, just the rustling of trees and the occasional chirp of a bird. It felt isolated, completely cut off from everything. That was what I wanted. A weekend alone, away from everything. I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat, stepped out, and stretched my legs. The air was crisp, the kind that smelled like damp earth and pine needles. The front door was locked, just as the owner had said it would be, so I reached under the porch mat and found the key. It was old and slightly rusted, but it turned in the lock with a heavy click. Inside, the cabin was simple. One main room with a small kitchenette along the back wall. A wooden table with 2 chairs, a fireplace, and a single doorway leading to the bedroom. A few hunting trophies hung on the walls, deer antlers, a dusty old rifle mounted above the fireplace. A stack of firewood sat neatly beside it. I dropped my bag onto the floor, set my keys on the table, and walked over to the single window, pulling back the curtain. The forest stretched out beyond the clearing, dark and dense. I could barely see past the first few rows of trees before everything blurred into shadow. I let the curtain fall back into place. I wasn't afraid of being alone out here. I had done plenty of solo trips before, but something about the way the trees stood so close, the way the shadows seemed deeper than normal, put me on edge. I shook the feeling off, telling myself I was just tired from the drive. I started unpacking, setting my flashlight and knife on the nightstand by the bed, then pulling out a few cans of food and placing them on the small counter. I had brought enough supplies for 2 nights, some canned soup, protein bars, water bottles. No electricity, no running water. Just a propane stove and a pump well outside. After setting everything up, I stepped back onto the porch. The sun had dipped below the trees, and the sky had taken on that deep, dark blue color just before night fully settles in. The temperature had dropped too, enough that I could see my breath in the air. The woods felt even heavier now, silent. Not even the wind moved through the trees. I leaned against the railing, listening, scanning the edge of the clearing. Nothing, just trees stretching out endlessly. Then I heard it, a single sharp snap, a branch breaking somewhere in the trees. I turned my head toward the sound, my eyes narrowing. It hadn't been a small twig, but something thicker, heavier, like a footstep. I stayed still, listening. A moment passed, then another. Nothing, probably just an animal. A deer, maybe, could have been anything. I stayed there for a few more minutes, watching, before finally stepping back inside and locking the door. I built a fire in the fireplace, the warmth filling the cabin quickly. The flames crackled, casting flickering light across the wooden walls. I ate a protein bar, drank some water, then stretched out on the bed, my knife close by on the nightstand. Outside, the woods remained silent. I woke up suddenly. Something had woken me, but I wasn't sure what. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow across the room. My mouth was dry. My heart was beating faster than it should have been. I lay still, listening. Then I heard it, a sound just outside the cabin. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Someone was walking around the cabin. I didn't move. My hand slid quietly toward the knife on the nightstand. My breath came slow and controlled. The footsteps circled around the cabin, crunching softly through the frost-covered grass. Not an animal. The steps were too steady, too careful. I gripped the knife tighter. The steps reached the porch. The wooden boards creaked under the weight of something heavy. I stayed frozen. Then, the The doorknob rattled. I nearly stopped breathing. It wasn't forceful, not like someone trying to break in. Just testing. Then silence. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing. No movement. No sound. I strained my ears, listening for anything, any sign of movement, but the woods had gone completely still. Minutes passed. I stayed awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, gripping the knife, listening. Eventually, exhaustion took over. I drifted into a light, restless sleep. Morning came slowly. The fire was completely dead, the cabin cold. I sat up, my muscles stiff. My eyes burned from lack of sleep. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined it. Then I stepped onto the porch and saw the footprints, large, heavy boot prints circling the cabin. Pausing at the door, they led back into the trees. I scanned the edge of the clearing, heart pounding. Whoever had been out here was gone. I locked up the cabin, packed my things, and left. I didn't look back. I never went back to that cabin again. The cabin belonged to my uncle. He had bought it years ago, intending to fix it up and use it as a hunting retreat. But life got in the way, and it sat abandoned deep in the woods, untouched for years. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small one-story structure made of rough-cut logs, with a metal roof that rusted more with each passing season. There was no electricity, no running water, and no insulation to keep the cold out. The only source of heat was an old wood-burning stove in the center of the single-room cabin. I had never been there before, but I knew about it. My uncle mentioned it sometimes, usually as a joke. "That old shack is probably more rat than wood by now," he'd say. I never gave it much thought until I needed a place to stay. Life had taken a turn. I won't get into all the details, but I needed to get away. No money, no job, no plan. Just a few $100 in my bank account and a car that could barely make it up a steep hill. My uncle offered me the cabin. "Stay as long as you want," he said. "Just don't expect much." I packed up a few things, mostly canned food, water jugs, and an old sleeping bag, and drove out there one late afternoon in October. The road was rough, just a narrow dirt path winding through dense forest, barely wide enough for my car. The trees pressed in on either side, their branches reaching across the path like skeletal fingers. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows over the clearing. It was smaller than I expected, maybe 20 feet wide and 30 feet long. The logs were dark with age, and the windows were covered in grime. The front door sagged on its hinges, and the porch was nothing more than a few rotting planks. I stood there for a moment, staring at it, wondering if this was a mistake. But I didn't have anywhere else to go. The inside was even worse. Dust covered everything. Spiderwebs hung from the rafters. The wood stove was rusted, but it looked like it would still work. There was an old cot in the corner with a thin mattress, a rickety wooden table with one chair, and a few shelves along the walls. A single lantern sat on the table, along with a half-empty box of matches. I set my things down, unrolled my sleeping bag on the cot, and started a fire in the stove. The wood was dry, and the fire caught quickly. Within minutes, the cabin was filled with the smell of burning pine and a faint warmth that barely pushed back the evening chill. I explored a little, opening the cabinets and drawers, finding nothing but dust and dead insects. Then I saw it. The doll. It sat on one of the shelves, half hidden behind an old coffee can. At first, I thought it was just a pile of rags, but when I pulled it out, I realized what it was. A small, cloth doll, about a foot tall, with button eyes and a stitched mouth. Its fabric was faded and dirty, its limbs limp and fragile. Something about it made my stomach tighten. I don't know why it bothered me so much. It wasn't anything special, just an old toy, but there was something wrong about it. I turned it over in my hands, feeling the rough fabric, the uneven stitching. The buttons for eyes weren't matching. One was slightly larger than the other. The mouth was stitched in a tight, crooked line. There was something stuffed inside it, something firm but uneven, like it had been filled with scraps of fabric or maybe sawdust. I set it back on the shelf and moved on. That night, I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the fire crackle and pop. The wind outside rattled the windows, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called out. The cabin creaked as it settled. Just the normal sounds of an old structure in the woods. But I couldn't stop thinking about the doll. It wasn't fear exactly, more like unease. Like the feeling you get when you realize someone's been watching you, but you don't know for how long. At some point, I fell asleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling stiff and cold. The fire had gone out sometime in the night, and the inside of the cabin was nearly as cold as the air outside. I got up, stretched, and started another fire. As I moved around, my eyes kept drifting back to the shelf. The doll was still there, exactly where I left it, but it felt different. I couldn't explain why, but something about it seemed off. I shook the feeling off and went about my day. I gathered firewood, cleared out some of the dust, and tried to make the place feel a little less abandoned. As the sun set, I cooked a can of beans over the stove and sat at the table, eating in silence. When I finished, I glanced at the doll again. This time, I was sure. It had moved. It wasn't a big change, just a slight shift in position, but it wasn't where I had left it. I knew that for certain. My first thought was that maybe it had fallen over and I hadn't noticed, or maybe a draft had knocked it over. But no, it hadn't fallen. It had turned slightly, like it had been nudged. I stared at it for a long time, my appetite gone. Maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe I was overthinking it. That night, I put the doll in the cabinet and shut the door. I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept picturing the doll sitting on the shelf, its button eyes staring at me. When I finally did drift off, I had strange dreams. Flashes of cloth and thread, a tight, pulling sensation, the feeling of something small and cold pressed against my skin. When I woke up, I felt exhausted. I got up, stretched, and went to light the fire. That's when I saw the cabinet door. It was open, just a few inches, but definitely open. And the doll was back on the shelf. I stared at it, my heart hammering in my chest. I knew with absolute certainty that I had put it in the cabinet. I had closed the door. Hadn't I? I tried to reason it out. Maybe I had been too tired. Maybe I had thought about putting it away but hadn't actually done it. Maybe the cabinet door didn't latch properly, and the wind had knocked it open. None of those explanations felt right. That night, I took the doll outside. I walked a good distance away from the cabin, into the trees, and tossed it into the underbrush. Then I went back inside, shut the door, and locked it. I felt better knowing the doll was gone. The cabin seemed lighter, less oppressive. I sat by the fire, eating a can of soup, enjoying the warmth. Then I turned around. The doll was sitting on the shelf. My hands went cold. I stood up so fast the chair scraped against the floor. My stomach twisted, and I felt dizzy. Couldn't breathe. I grabbed the doll and took it outside again, this time walking even farther. I found a deep hole near an old tree stump, stuffed the doll inside, and covered it with dirt and rocks. When I went back inside, I locked the door and shoved a chair under the handle. I didn't sleep at all. I left at dawn. I packed my things, threw everything into my car, and drove away without looking back. I never told my uncle what happened. I didn't have an explanation that made sense. I still don't. All I know is that when I got home, I found something in the trunk of my car. A small, cloth doll with mismatched button eyes and a crooked stitched mouth. The road to the cabin was barely more than a dirt path, narrow and rough, cutting through a stretch of thick forest. The trees on either side stood tall, their branches reaching over like skeletal arms, blocking most of the sky. My tires bumped and jolted over the uneven ground, loose gravel crunching underneath. The drive had taken longer than expected. What was supposed to be a 3-hour trip had turned into nearly 5 thanks to a mix of bad directions, patchy cell service, and the fact that the last 40 miles were nothing but winding back roads. I had rented the cabin for a long weekend. It was supposed to be a quiet escape, Just me, the woods, and some time to clear my head. No work, no people, no distractions. Just simple, isolated peace. I had found it online. An old hunting cabin deep in a valley, tucked far away from the nearest town. The description had promised solitude, fresh air, and nothing but the sounds of nature. The listing had also mentioned the place being rustic, which I quickly realized was code for old, small, and not particularly well maintained. When I finally pulled up, the cabin looked smaller than I expected. The wood was dark and weathered, the porch sagging slightly. A single light bulb hung above the front door, but it was off. The place had no visible power lines, so I assumed it ran on a generator. I stepped out of the car, stretching my legs. The air was cool, thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. The only sounds were the rustling of trees and the distant call of birds. No traffic noise, no hum of civilization, just quiet. I grabbed my bags and headed for the front door, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. The key was in a lockbox, just like the owner had said. I let myself in and set my things down. Inside, the place was about as basic as it got. A single room with a small kitchen against the back wall, a couch, a wood-burning stove, and a narrow bed pushed up against the far side. A door to the right led to what I assumed was the bathroom. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, and only one outlet near the kitchen counter. The walls were lined with shelves holding old hunting magazines, mismatched dishes, and a few random supplies. Candles, a flashlight, and a rusted can opener. A woodpile sat near the stove, along with an old axe leaned against the wall. I checked my phone, no signal, not even a single bar. That didn't surprise me. I had lost service nearly an hour back. I had expected this, though, and it was part of the reason I had come. No distractions, just me and the quiet. I spent the next hour unpacking and settling in. The place smelled musty, like old wood and damp air, but it wasn't terrible. I opened a window to let in some fresh air. The sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows across the trees outside. I decided to get a fire going before it got too dark. I stepped back onto the porch, scanning the surrounding woods. The trees stretched endlessly in all directions, a sea of green and brown. No signs of other people, no distant houses, no power lines, just wilderness. I gathered some firewood from a small pile near the side of the cabin and brought it inside. The wood stove took some effort, but after a few tries, I got a fire going. The warmth spread quickly, taking the edge off the evening chill. By the time I finished making a quick dinner, the sky was fully dark. The only light came from the fire and a single lantern I had placed on the table. The silence was heavy, not eerie exactly, but noticeable. I was used to background noise, traffic, neighbors, the hum of electronics. Here there was nothing, just the occasional creak of wood as the cabin settled and the distant sound of wind moving through the trees. I sat on the couch, staring into the fire, listening to the faint crackle of burning wood. It was peaceful, exactly what I had wanted. But then, I heard something outside, faint rustling, slow, deliberate. At first, I told myself it was the wind, or maybe an animal, raccoons, deer, something harmless. But then I heard it again, closer, the sound of something moving through the brush, careful, steady, not crashing through like a deer would, not the frantic scurrying of a small animal. It was something moving with intent. I stood up, heart pounding. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows against the walls. I walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. Nothing but trees, just blackness beyond the glow of the lantern. The sound stopped. I waited, listening. Nothing. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my nerves. Being alone in a place like this could play tricks on the mind. The silence, the isolation, it made every little noise feel bigger than it was. I sat back down, trying to focus on the warmth of the fire, the steady crackling of the logs. But then, about 15 minutes later, I heard it again. Closer this time. Footsteps. Slow. Not heavy, not stomping, just deliberate, like someone trying to move quietly. I grabbed the flashlight from the shelf and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness outside, illuminating the trees. But I saw nothing. Still, the feeling stuck with me. That heavy, creeping sense that someone was out there, watching, waiting. I locked the door. For the next hour, I sat by the fire, listening, waiting. The footsteps didn't return, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Eventually, exhaustion won out. I forced myself to lie down, staring at the wooden ceiling. The fire burned low, the cabin dimming. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination, just the unfamiliar sounds of the woods at night. I drifted off. I woke up to the sound of the porch creaking. My blood ran cold. I sat up, heart hammering, ears straining. Another creak. Someone was on the porch. I reached for the flashlight, my hands shaking. I clicked it on and aimed it at the door. Silence. Then, a slow, deliberate knock. Not hard, not urgent, just a knock. I didn't move. Another knock. Then silence. I sat there, frozen, barely breathing. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. I didn't hear anything else. Eventually, exhaustion overtook fear. I stayed awake until dawn, listening, waiting. When the sun rose, I finally gathered the courage to open the door. The porch was empty. The woods were still. But in the dirt right outside the cabin were footprints. Barefoot, too large to be mine. I left that morning. I was never the kind of person who liked being alone in the woods. I had grown up in a city, spent most of my life surrounded by traffic, streetlights, and the constant hum of people moving around. So when my friend Jason offered me his family's cabin for a weekend getaway, I hesitated. It wasn't that I was scared of the outdoors. I had been camping a few times, but the idea of being completely alone in the middle of nowhere didn't sit right with me. But I needed a break. Work had been exhausting, and I told myself it would be a good chance to disconnect from everything. No emails, no phone calls, just me and nature. Jason reassured me that the cabin was well maintained. It had electricity, running water, and even an old but functional heater for the colder nights. It wasn't some rundown shack. It was a solid log cabin with a small clearing around it and thick forest on all sides. It took me about 5 hours to drive there. The last hour was on a narrow dirt road, winding through dense trees. My car rocked on the uneven ground, and I had to slow down to avoid hitting deep ruts in the path. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the cabin. It looked exactly like Jason had described. A sturdy wooden structure with a pitched roof and a wide porch out front. There was a small shed off to the side, and a rusted fire pit with a few logs around it. The forest pressed in from all directions, thick and dark. I parked my car close to the cabin, grabbed my backpack, and stepped onto the porch. The wooden planks creaked under my weight. I unlocked the door, pushed it open, and was immediately hit with the smell of old wood and dust. The inside was simple but comfortable. There was a fireplace, a small kitchen, a couch, and a narrow hallway leading to a single bedroom and bathroom. I dropped my bag on the couch and started checking the place out. Everything seemed fine. The lights worked, the water ran, and the heater kicked on without an issue. I went outside to grab some firewood from the shed, and that's when I noticed something that made me stop. Near the tree line, about 50 feet away, was a pile of something. At first, I thought it was just a stack of branches, but as I walked closer, I realized it was a heap of bones. Animal bones, scattered in a rough circle, some of them still connected by dried ligaments. Most looked small, rabbits maybe, but there were larger ones too. A deer skull lay half-buried under leaves. I felt a chill run through me. It was probably just the remains of a predator's kill, but the way they were arranged didn't seem natural. I stood there for a moment, listening to the forest. It was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the faint hum of the wind through the trees. I shook it off and went back inside. The sun was setting, and I wasn't about to let a pile of bones ruin my weekend. I made a quick dinner, lit a fire, and sat on the couch with a book. The silence outside made the crackling flames sound louder than they should have. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to hear. It was faint, a slow, deliberate crunching of leaves, somewhere near the porch. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the porch and the trees beyond. Nothing, just the still, empty forest. I told myself it was probably an animal, a raccoon or a fox. Still, I locked the door before heading to bed. The next day was uneventful. I hiked a bit, chopped some wood, and spent the afternoon fishing in a small stream Jason had told me about. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was already dipping below the trees. I grilled the fish over the fire pit outside, eating as the sky turned dark. That's when I saw them. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But no, the shadows between the trees weren't just trees. There were figures standing there, at least 3 of them just barely visible in the dim light. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching. My stomach dropped. I forced myself to stay calm, acting like I hadn't noticed. I casually stood up, grabbed my plate, and walked back into the cabin, locking the door behind me. I turned off all the lights and peeked through the window. The figures were gone. The forest looked empty again. I barely slept that night. Every little sound had me on edge. The wind against the walls, the creaking of the trees, even my own breathing seemed too loud. I should have left. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was imagining things. But I didn't want to be the guy who ran home scared because of a few shadows in the woods. That night, I made sure my flashlight and my hunting knife were within reach before I went to bed. I forced myself to sleep. Then I woke up to the door handle turning. The lock held, but I could hear it. Slow, deliberate movements, like someone was testing it. Then soft footsteps on the porch. I held my breath, gripping the knife so hard my hand ached. The footsteps moved away, circling the cabin. Then silence. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. Then, ***, a loud bang against the window. ***. I nearly dropped the knife. My flashlight was in my other hand, and I clicked it on, aiming at the window. Nothing, just darkness. Then I saw the footprints, right outside in the dirt, bare feet. I stayed awake until dawn. The moment the sun was up, I packed my things. I barely ate, barely drank. I just threw everything into my bag and got ready to leave. But before I could, I noticed something on the porch. A single rabbit skull, placed right in front of the door. I didn't waste any more time. I got in my car and drove, barely looking back. When I reached the main road, I finally let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something standing at the edge of the trees. But there was nothing. I never told Jason exactly what happened, just that his family's cabin wasn't for me. He laughed, said he never liked staying there alone either. I never went back. I was looking forward to the quiet. A weekend alone in a cabin, deep in the woods, away from the city noise, work emails, and the constant buzz of people. It wasn't my first time staying somewhere remote, but this was farther out than I'd ever been. The cabin belonged to a friend of a friend, an old family property they rarely used anymore. When I asked about renting it for a weekend, they were more than happy to let me take it off their hands for a few days. The drive up was long, hours of highway, then another hour on winding back roads before turning onto a narrow dirt path. The kind of road where you hope you don't meet another car because there's no way both would fit. Thick trees pressed in on either side, their branches arching overhead, blocking out most of the afternoon sun. The road stretched on farther than I expected, just a single lane path cutting through the dense forest. No houses, no mailboxes, no signs of life. Finally, the cabin came into view. It sat in a small clearing, a simple one-story structure with a wraparound porch. The wood was dark with age, but it looked solid. A stack of firewood sat against one wall, and an old rocking chair rested near the door. Beyond the cabin, the trees started again, tall and endless. No neighbors, no streetlights, just the woods, stretching for miles in every direction. I parked my truck beside the cabin and stepped out. The air smelled fresh, earthy, with a hint of pine. It was silent, apart from the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, no dogs barking. Just quiet. Exactly what I wanted. Inside, the cabin was basic but comfortable. A main room with a fireplace and a couch. A small kitchen, a bedroom and a bathroom. The furniture was old but sturdy. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, but that was the point. Just me, the woods, and nothing else. I spent the rest of the afternoon settling in, unpacking my bag, stacking some firewood inside, and making sure everything was in working order. There was an old radio on the shelf, the kind that only picked up AM stations. I turned it on, but all I got was static. By the time the sun dipped below the trees, I was outside on the porch, drinking a beer and enjoying the quiet. The sky was a deep purple, fading into black, and the stars were brighter than I'd ever seen them. Then I heard it, a single distant bark. I sat up, listening. Nothing. I shook it off. Probably just a coyote. There were plenty of them out here. I'd heard them before while camping, their yips and howls carrying through the trees. I finished my beer and went inside, locking the door behind me. That night, I slept soundly. The bed was old but comfortable, and the silence was the kind that wrapped around you, deep and heavy. The next morning, I went for a walk, following an old hunting trail behind the cabin. The woods were dense, but the path was clear enough. The air was crisp, the ground soft with fallen leaves. I walked for about an hour before turning back. That's when I saw it. A dog, standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the tree line. It was big, black, with thick fur and pointed ears. At first, I thought it was a stray, maybe a lost hunting dog. But something about it felt off. It just stood there, completely still, watching me. I took a step forward. It didn't move. I whistled, but it didn't react. No tail wag, no sign of recognition. Just those dark eyes locked onto me. Something about the way it stood, rigid, tense, made my skin crawl. I had the sudden feeling that I shouldn't be looking at it. I turned and walked back to the cabin, not wanting to show any nervousness. The feeling of being watched didn't leave until I was inside. The door shut and locked behind me. For the rest of the day, I didn't see it again. That evening, I built a fire in the fireplace and cooked dinner. The cabin felt safe, warm. I almost forgot about the dog. Almost. Around 9 p.m., I stepped outside onto the porch. The air was colder now, the sky darker. The trees loomed black against the stars. Then I saw it again. The dog, standing in the exact same spot as before, just at the edge of the clearing. Still unmoving, still watching. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. Something wasn't right. If it was lost, why wasn't it moving? If it was a stray, why didn't it act like one? I'd seen lost dogs before. They sniffed around, looked anxious, tried to approach people. This one just stood there. I went inside and locked the door. Lying in bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. Then I heard it, scratching, slow, deliberate, right outside the bedroom wall. I held my breath, my heart hammering. The sound moved, a soft, dragging scrape, now near the window. I turned my head slightly. The curtains were closed. Couldn't see out. Then, a low guttural sound. Not a growl, not quite. Something deeper, more unnatural. I didn't move, didn't breathe. After what felt like an eternity, the sound stopped. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. But when I stepped outside, I saw the tracks. Large paw prints circling the cabin. Not just one set, several. I followed them around the porch to the back of the cabin, where they stopped, right beneath my bedroom window. My stomach twisted. It had been right there, watching me. I grabbed my keys, threw my bag into the truck, and got in. As I started the engine, I glanced back one last time. The dog was there, closer now, just at the edge of the porch, still watching. I didn't wait. I backed out, tires kicking up dirt, speeding down that narrow road. I didn't stop until I was back on the highway, miles away from that cabin. I never asked my friend about it, never went back. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't just a dog. The cabin had been in my family for 3 generations. A small wooden structure deep in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. It was nothing special, just a one-room building with a loft for sleeping, a wood-burning stove, and an outhouse out back. It sat on 40 acres of dense forest, thick with pine, maple, and birch, with no neighbors for miles. My grandfather built it in the 1960s as a hunting retreat, and my father and uncles had used it every fall for deer season. As a kid, I spent summers there with my dad, learning how to fish in the nearby river and shoot a rifle. By the time I was in my late 20s, the cabin had fallen out of use. My father had passed, and my uncles were too old for long hunting trips. I had moved to Chicago for work, and the cabin sat empty most of the year, except for the occasional visit. But in the fall of 2018, I decided to take a solo trip out there for a long weekend. I was between jobs, needing a break from city life, and the thought of spending a few nights in the quiet of the woods sounded perfect. I arrived on a Friday afternoon, parking my truck on the narrow dirt road that led up to the cabin. The place looked the same as I remembered: weathered wood, a sagging front porch, and an old metal chimney sticking out of the roof. The forest around it was thick and quiet, the air crisp with the coming of winter. There was no electricity or running water, just a propane lantern and a hand pump for well water. I spent the first few hours chopping firewood, checking the structure for any damage, and setting up my sleeping bag in the loft. By the time night fell, the temperature had dropped, and the forest had taken on an eerie stillness. I sat by the wood stove, eating a can of chili and listening to the distant sounds of the woods. An owl hooting, the rustle of wind through the trees. Felt peaceful. But as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed something strange. The woods had gone completely silent. Anyone who spent time in the deep woods knows that nature is never truly quiet. There are always small sounds: the chirp of crickets, the scampering of squirrels, the occasional rustling of something unseen. But now there was nothing, not even the wind, just an unnatural stillness that set my nerves on edge. I shook it off and climbed into the loft, wrapping myself in my sleeping bag. The fire in the stove cast flickering shadows on the walls, and I told myself it was just my imagination making things seem off. I was alone in the woods, of course it would feel unsettling. Sometime in the night, I woke up to a sound, a deep, guttural breathing. At first, I thought I was dreaming. I lay still, listening, my breath caught in my throat. The sound was coming from outside, low and rhythmic, like the slow exhale of something large. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a deer or a bear. I had spent enough time in the woods to know what those sounded like. This was different. The breathing moved, circling the cabin. Heavy footsteps crunched in the fallen leaves, deliberate and slow. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay there, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps stopped near the front door, and I heard something. Asterisk, a sniffing noise, deep and wet, like an animal scenting the air. Asterisk. Then a low growl. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay still. The only weapon I had was my hunting rifle, which was propped against the wall near the stove. But to get to it, I'd have to climb down from the loft, and that meant making noise. So I lay there, heart hammering, listening to whatever was outside. It moved again, stepping onto the porch. The old wooden boards creaked under its weight. Then came a sound that sent a chill straight through me. Asterisk, the doorknob rattling. Asterisk, it was testing the door. My breath caught in my throat. No animal does that. A bear might paw at a door, a raccoon might scratch, but this was something else. I reached for my rifle as slowly as I could, my fingers shaking. The door was locked, but the cabin wasn't exactly a fortress. If this thing wanted in, it would find a way. The rattling stopped. Silence stretched out for what felt like hours, and then I heard it move away, stepping down from the porch. But it didn't leave. I could still hear the breathing, low, steady, just beyond the walls. I barely slept that night, gripping my rifle in my hands, listening. By morning, the sounds were gone. I waited until the sun was fully up before stepping outside, rifle at the ready. The forest was back to normal, the birds chirping, the distant rustle of squirrels in the trees. But on the ground, just outside the cabin, I found footprints. They were huge, larger than any wolf or bear print I'd ever seen. But what made my stomach drop was their shape. Asterisk like a man's foot, but elongated with deep claw marks at the tips. Asterisk. I stared at them for a long time, my mind struggling to make sense of it. There were no drag marks, no sign of a person wearing boots. Just these massive prints leading from the woods to my porch and then back again. I should have left then, but a part of me didn't want to believe what I was seeing. I told myself it had to be a bear, even though I knew it wasn't. That night it came back. The same slow breathing, the same heavy footsteps, but this time it didn't just rattle the doorknob. It scratched at the walls, long, deliberate drags of claws against the wood. It circled the cabin for hours, moving between the trees and then returning. At one point, I heard it climb onto the roof, its weight shifting above me. I stayed in the loft, rifle in hand, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. And then, just before dawn, came the worst part. I heard it speak. Not words, not human speech, but a sound, a warped, garbled attempt at mimicry. It sounded like my own voice, calling out from the treeline. Help! My blood went cold. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. And then, finally, it left. When the sun rose, I packed my things, threw them into the truck, and got the hell out of there. I didn't stop until I was 50 miles away. I haven't been back since. A few months later, I told my uncle about it. He was quiet for a long time before saying, "You saw it, didn't you?" I asked what he meant. He just shook his head. "Something's out there, always has been. That's why your granddad stopped coming up here." I never went back to the cabin. I don't know if it's still standing, and I don't want to find out. I built the cabin myself. Not from scratch, not from trees I felled with my own hands, but I put in the work. Hauled the lumber, nailed the walls, sealed the gaps. It was mine. A small, one-room structure deep in the woods, far from town, where the only sounds were wind through the trees and whatever animals happened to be passing through. That was the point. I didn't come out here for company. I came to hunt, to be alone, to live by my own rules. It wasn't anything fancy. Just 4 sturdy walls, a sloped roof, and a stone chimney I stacked myself. The inside had a cot in the corner, a wood stove for heat, a small table, and a few shelves with supplies. There was no electricity, no running water, just a well out back and a latrine I dug far enough away to keep the smell from ruining my mornings. The cabin sat on a rise overlooking a small clearing, a perfect spot for hunting. I had a tree stand a little ways off, but when the weather was bad or when I just didn't feel like making the hike, I could sit right on my porch, rifle in hand, and wait for something to come wandering by. It was the middle of deer season, and I'd been out here for a few days already. The days were short, the nights long, and the air had that biting cold that made your breath hang in front of you like smoke. I'd taken down a buck the day before, a solid 8-pointer, enough meat to last me a good while. But I still had time, and I wasn't in a hurry to head back to town. That evening, I sat on my porch, rifle resting on my lap, watching the tree line. The sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the clearing. The woods were still, except for the occasional rustle of leaves when the wind picked up. I wasn't expecting much, not after the shot I'd fired the day before, but sometimes you get lucky. Sometimes another deer comes along, or maybe a coyote looking for scraps. It was quiet, too quiet. Normally, even if you don't see anything, you still hear the forest. Birds, small animals scurrying through the underbrush, the distant hoot of an owl as the sky darkens. But that night, there was nothing, just the wind. I stayed out a little longer, watching, listening. Still nothing. Eventually, I stood, stretched, and decided to head inside. I bolted the door behind me, set my rifle against the wall, and started up the stove. The fire crackled, warming the small space, filling it with the comforting scent of burning wood. I took off my boots, stretched out on the cot, and closed my eyes. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was awake, staring at the ceiling. I wasn't sure what had woken me, but I had that feeling, like something was off. I lay still, listening. Then I heard it, a sound from outside, a slow, deliberate crunch of snow. Then another, and another. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a falling branch. Someone was out there. I sat up slowly, reaching for my rifle. The fire had died down to embers, casting just enough light for me to see my breath hanging in the air. I crept to the window, careful not to make a sound, and peered outside. At first, I didn't see anything. Just the clearing, the trees, the faint glow of moonlight on the snow. But then, movement. A dark shape near the edge of the trees. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't a coyote. It was standing on two legs. I tightened my grip on the rifle, heart pounding. I wasn't afraid. At least that's what I told myself. But there was something about the way it stood there, just at the tree line, unmoving, watching, that made my skin crawl. I didn't call out. What was the point? Whoever it was, they weren't lost. No one just wandered this deep into the woods by accident. If they needed help, they would have called out. If they were hunting, they wouldn't have just been standing there like that. I waited, watched, tried to slow my breathing. After what felt like forever, the figure moved. It stepped back, melting into the trees, vanishing into the darkness. I stayed at the window a while longer, but I didn't see anything else. Eventually, I moved away, keeping my rifle close. I didn't go back to bed. I just sat at the table, listening. Hours passed. Then, just before dawn, I heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time. I gripped the rifle, heart hammering. The footsteps weren't at the tree line anymore. They were just outside. Then, a slow, deliberate tap against the wooden wall of the cabin. I raised the rifle, aiming at the door. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Another tap. I was done waiting. I moved fast, flipping the latch, throwing the door open. The cold rushed in, my breath fogging the air. The clearing was empty. No footprints in the snow. Nothing. But the feeling hadn't gone away. I stepped out onto the porch, scanning the tree line, finger tight on the trigger. My heart was pounding, my mind racing. Then I saw them. Not one, not two, more. Figures standing just beyond the trees, half hidden in the darkness. Watching, I raised the rifle. They didn't move. I could feel my pulse in my ears. The sky was getting lighter, dawn creeping in. I didn't look away. Then, just as silently as they had come, they turned and slipped back into the trees, one by one, disappearing into the shadows. I stood there for a long time, rifle still raised, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. When the sun finally broke over the trees, I packed up my things. I didn't look back. I don't know why I agreed to go. Maybe I felt like I owed them, or maybe I just wanted to prove something to myself. Either way, I regretted it before we even got there. The plan was simple. 5 days at a cabin deep in the mountains, completely off-grid. No phone service, no internet, no neighbors. Just a long dirt road leading to an old, isolated cabin that had been sitting empty for years. It belonged to my friend's uncle, who hadn't been back since his wife died. No one knew much about the place except that it was far from everything. I drove up alone, following the directions they gave me, since the others had left earlier in a separate car. The further I went, the worse the road got. The paved highway turned to gravel, then to dirt, then to something that barely even looked like a road anymore. Just ruts in the ground, winding through thick forest. I hadn't seen a house, a sign, or even another car in nearly an hour. My gas gauge was lower than I would have liked. I should have filled up before I left town, but I hadn't thought about how long the drive would be. If anything went wrong, there was no way I'd have enough to get back. The sun was already getting low by the time I finally saw the turnoff. A narrow trail leading into the trees, just wide enough for a car. The cabin was supposed to be about a mile in. The road was worse than I expected. Deep potholes, fallen branches, and thick mud from the recent rain made every second feel like I was going to get stuck. The trees pressed in on both sides, branches scraping against my car like fingers dragging across metal. My headlights barely cut through the shadows. I kept waiting to see the cabin, but the road just kept going. The trees were so dense that I couldn't see anything beyond them. Just endless forest, dark and silent. I turned off the radio without realizing it, feeling uneasy. It wasn't fear exactly, but something about the place felt wrong. Finally, just as I was starting to wonder if I'd taken a wrong turn, the trees opened up, revealing the cabin. It was older than I expected. A long, single-story structure with a sagging roof and a wraparound porch, its wooden walls dark with age. The windows were shut tight, the curtains drawn. A rusted-out truck sat abandoned to one side, half buried in the overgrowth. The place looked like no one had set foot here in years. The other car was parked out front, but I didn't see anyone. No voices, no movement, nothing. I pulled up beside their car and killed the engine. The silence was immediate. No birds, no wind, just the creaking of the trees. I stepped out, my boots sinking into the wet ground. The air smelled like damp wood and earth. The place felt still, too still. I walked up to the porch, the old boards groaning under my weight. The door was unlocked. I pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick and stale, like the cabin had been sealed up for years. The main room was just as old as the outside, with wooden walls and a stone fireplace that hadn't been used in ages. Dust covered everything. The only sign of life was the pile of backpacks by the wall. But there was no one there. I stood in the doorway listening. The whole place felt dead. Then I noticed the back door. It was wide open. I hesitated, then stepped inside. My boots left tracks in the dust as I moved toward the back door. The porch light was on, casting a weak glow onto the trees beyond. The forest stretched out in every direction, thick and endless. And then I saw the footprints. They led from the door, down the steps, and into the trees. Not just one set, several. Deep, heavy prints in the mud. I recognized my friend's boot prints among them. But there were others too, bigger ones. I swallowed hard, scanning the treeline. The footprints disappeared into the darkness. Where the hell were they? I stepped back inside and shut the door. The cabin had 3 bedrooms and a small kitchen. I checked them all. Empty. Their bags were still here, but their phones and jackets were gone. They wouldn't have just left. I grabbed my flashlight from my bag and stepped back onto the porch. The woods pressed in on all sides, thick and black. I took a few steps down the path, following the prints. The air felt colder out here, the trees looming overhead. My flashlight beam wavered as I moved deeper. The footprints led further than I was comfortable following. They didn't scatter or turn back. They just went straight into the trees. And then they stopped. Just stopped. No sign of struggle, no turning around. Just deep impressions in the mud, ending abruptly like whoever made them had been lifted straight off the ground. I felt something then, something deep and primal. A warning. I turned and hurried back to the cabin. I locked the doors. The night dragged on. Every noise outside made my skin crawl. I kept expecting them to come back, to hear laughter, footsteps, something. But there was nothing, just silence. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because I woke to the sound of something outside, a low, deliberate scraping against the porch. I sat up, heart hammering. The room was pitch black. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The sound came again, slow, steady, something moving against the wood. I crept to the window and pulled the curtain back just enough to see. The porch was empty, but the chair that had been sitting by the door was gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just sat there listening. By morning, I made my decision. I packed my bag, grabbed my keys, and got the hell out of there. The drive back was worse than the drive in. Every shadow between the trees felt like something watching. My hands were shaking by the time I reached the main road. I stopped at the first gas station I found and asked the cashier if they knew anything about the cabin. They just looked at me, then shook their head. "That place?" they said finally. "No one's been out there in years. Not since the uncle went missing." I didn't ask any more questions. I just filled up my tank and left. I never heard from my friends again. Their families searched, the police searched, but nothing was ever found. No footprints, no bodies, just an abandoned cabin in the woods. I still don't know what happened to them, and I don't want to. The drive up to the cabin took longer than expected. The road was rough, a single dirt path carved into the forest, winding endlessly through thick pines and skeletal birches. My tires spun in the loose gravel at times, forcing me to slow down, my truck bouncing in and out of shallow potholes. I hadn't seen another car in over an hour. It was supposed to be a quiet retreat, a chance to get away, clear my head, and spend a few days surrounded by nothing but trees, water, and the distant hum of wind moving through the branches. My uncle owned the cabin, a small A-frame structure tucked near the shore of Deadwood Lake. He barely used it anymore, said he was getting too old for the drive, and offered to let me stay whenever I wanted. I didn't hesitate. A weekend alone in the woods sounded perfect. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was dipping low behind the treetops. The place looked exactly how I remembered. Weathered wooden walls, a slanted metal roof, and a wraparound deck overlooking the lake. The water was dark and still, stretching out in a perfect mirror under the sky. I climbed out of my truck and stretched my legs. The air smelled crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. A few birds rustled in the trees, but otherwise, it was silent. The first thing I noticed was the cabin door. It was slightly open, not much, just an inch or two, as if someone had pushed it and never bothered to close it all the way. I frowned. My uncle was the type to double-check everything before leaving. He always made sure the doors were locked, the windows latched. Maybe he had forgotten this time. I stepped onto the porch, pushed the door open, and peered inside. Dust floated in the light streaming through the windows. Everything looked normal. The small kitchen to the right, a wooden table with 2 chairs, the couch facing an old stone fireplace. A single hallway led to the bedroom and bathroom. I took a cautious step inside. Nothing seemed disturbed. No muddy footprints, no broken glass. If someone had been here, they hadn't taken anything. I let out a breath and shook my head. Probably the wind. I grabbed my bags from the truck, set them inside, and checked my phone. No signal. That wasn't surprising. The reception out here was always terrible. I had told my uncle I'd be out of reach for a few days, so it wasn't a big deal. I locked the cabin door behind me. The first night passed without much trouble. I made a simple dinner, sat out on the deck, and listened to the forest settle into nighttime. Crickets chirped from the underbrush, and an owl hooted somewhere far off. The lake was completely still, smooth as glass, reflecting the moonlight. I went to bed early, letting the silence lull me to sleep. The second day, I hiked around the lake. The trail was old and barely visible in some places, overgrown with ferns and fallen leaves. I followed it anyway, moving through the trees, listening to the distant sound of water lapping against the shore. A few miles in, I found something odd. At first, I thought it was just an old fire pit, a blackened ring of stones with charred wood inside. But as I got closer, I noticed something else. Around the pit, there were small bones, dozens of them scattered across the dirt. Some looked like bird bones, others too large for that. I bent down and picked one up. It was smooth, picked clean, with no signs of teeth marks or decay. I stared at the pile for a while. It didn't make sense. Animals die in the woods all the time, but this was different. The bones weren't random. They were placed in a rough circle around the fire pit, like someone had arranged them. I dropped the bone and stood up. A weird feeling crawled over my skin. I turned and left. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I double-checked the cabin door, making sure it was locked. I shut all the windows. The fire in the stove crackled softly, casting flickering shadows against the walls. I lay in bed, listening. Nothing. I closed my eyes. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up. First, I wasn't sure why. I lay still, my heart thudding in my chest, ears straining against the darkness. Then I heard it, a soft scraping sound. It was coming from outside. I sat up slowly, my breath shallow. The sound came again, something dragging against wood. It was right outside the cabin. My pulse pounded in my ears. I swung my legs off the bed, moving carefully, silently. The fire had died down, leaving the room in deep shadows. I reached the window and peered out. The porch was empty. The lake beyond it was still. Nothing moved in the trees. I waited, holding my breath. Minutes passed. Nothing. Then, just as I started to relax, the sound came again. Closer this time. A slow, deliberate dragging sound. Something was moving along the side of the cabin. I grabbed the rifle my uncle kept under the bed, flicked off the safety, and stepped toward the door. I didn't open it. I just stood there, listening. The noise stopped. Silence. I waited, heart hammering. Then, from somewhere deep in the woods, I heard it. A low, distant whistle. Not an animal. Not the wind. It was a person. I stood there for what felt like forever. No other sounds came. Eventually, I climbed back into bed, rifle across my chest, and lay awake until the sun rose. The third day, I left. I packed my bags as soon as daylight hit. I didn't bother making breakfast, didn't even check the trail again. I threw my gear in the truck, started the engine, and didn't look back. The road felt longer on the way down. The whole time, I kept glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see something standing in the trees, watching me. By the time I reached town, my hands were shaking. I called my uncle from a gas station, told him I'd cut the trip short. I didn't mention what happened, just said I wasn't feeling well. He didn't question it. I haven't been back to that cabin since. I don't know how many people ever stop and really think about how isolated a cabin in the woods can be. People talk about how peaceful it is, how nice it must be to get away from everything. And yeah, sure, it is until you realize how alone you really are, how far away help is, how fast everything could go wrong. I learned that the hard way. A few years ago, I rented a cabin deep in the mountains for a week. I had been feeling burned out, just exhausted from everything. Work, people, the constant noise of city life. I wanted to get away from all of it, just for a little while. I found a place online, a small, one-room cabin about 15 miles from the nearest town, tucked away near a lake with nothing but trees in every direction. It looked perfect. The road leading up to it was rough, more of a dirt path than anything else. My car struggled over the rocks and dips in the ground, and I remember thinking that if anything happened to the car, I'd be screwed. There was no cell service, no houses for miles, and the road was too rough for a tow truck. But I pushed the thought aside. I wanted to be alone, and this was as alone as it got. The cabin itself was small, just a single room with a bed, a little kitchen area, and a wood stove for heat. There was an outhouse about 20 feet behind it and a small shed next to that. No electricity, no plumbing, no internet. Just me, the trees, and the lake. The first couple of days were exactly what I had hoped for. I spent my time hiking, fishing, sitting on the small porch with a book. At night, the silence was thick. No cars, no distant voices, just the sound of the wind moving through the trees and the occasional rustling of animals in the underbrush. I hadn't seen a single person since I got there. That changed on the third day. It was late afternoon, and I was out by the lake, watching the water move in slow, lazy ripples. The air was cool, and the sky was overcast, making the whole place feel even quieter than usual. I don't know why I turned around, but I did, and that's when I saw him, a man standing at the edge of the trees. He was far enough away that I couldn't make out much detail, but something about him immediately put me on edge. He wasn't hiking, he didn't have a backpack, no gear, nothing. He was just standing there, half hidden by the trees, watching me. I stared back at him, waiting for him to do something. Wave, call out, step forward, but he didn't. He just stood there. I could feel my heart start to pick up, my skin prickle. There was no reason for anyone to be out here. The cabin wasn't near any trails, and I hadn't seen any cars parked along the road. Something about the way he stood there, so still, made me feel exposed. After what felt like forever, he turned and walked back into the woods, disappearing into the trees without a sound. I stood there for a while, staring at the spot where he had been. Then I packed up my things and walked back to the cabin, trying to shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. That night, I locked the door. The next morning, I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just some guy out for a walk. Maybe a hunter scouting the area. Maybe a hiker who got turned around. I tried to convince myself that he wasn't watching me, that I had just imagined it. But I knew I hadn't. I spent most of the day inside, not really feeling up to wandering around anymore. I kept looking out the window, scanning the trees, half expecting to see him again. By the time the sun started going down, I had almost convinced myself that I was overreacting. The woods were big, and I couldn't be the only person who came out here. I built a fire in the little pit outside, made myself some food, and tried to relax. And then, just as the last light was fading, I heard something. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the trees behind the cabin. I froze, my whole body tensing. The fire cracked beside me, but beyond that, everything was silent. I strained my ears, listening. The footsteps stopped. I stood up, my pulse hammering. The sound had come from behind the cabin, near the outhouse and the shed. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the trees, but the beam was weak, barely cutting through the darkness. I didn't see anything. I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon, but I didn't believe it. I went inside, locked the door, and sat on the bed with my back against the wall, listening. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I went outside to check around the cabin. I didn't see any footprints, but the ground was hard and covered in leaves, so I wasn't sure I would have anyway. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. I wanted to leave. I wanted to pack up my stuff, get in my car, and drive back to town. But part of me felt stupid. I hadn't actually seen anything. I hadn't heard anything beyond those footsteps. Maybe it really had been an animal. Maybe I was letting my imagination get the best of me. So I stayed. That evening, I made sure to gather plenty of firewood before dark. I ate early, locked the door, and sat inside with my flashlight close by. And then, just like the night before, I heard it. Footsteps. But this time they didn't stop. They moved around the cabin, slow and deliberate. Not circling, just moving, sometimes closer, sometimes further away. I sat completely still, barely breathing. Then, after a long, terrible silence, I heard something else. A quiet, deliberate tap on the window. Just once. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I sat there, gripping my flashlight, staring at the window. I couldn't see anything outside, just my own reflection in the glass, wide-eyed and rigid with fear. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually, the footsteps moved away, and then everything was quiet again. I left at sunrise. I barely slept, jumping at every little sound, every shift of the wind against the trees. As soon as there was enough light to see, I threw my stuff into the car and got the hell out of there. I kept checking my mirrors as I drove, half expecting to see someone standing in the trees, watching me leave. But I never did. I don't know who he was. I don't know what he wanted. But I know he was there, and I know he was watching. I haven't been back to the woods since. I don't know what made me pick that cabin. Maybe it was the price. Maybe it was how far away it was from everything. Maybe I just wanted to be alone for a while. Whatever the reason, I rented it for 2 weeks, thinking I'd spend my time fishing, reading, and just getting some fresh air. The listing didn't have a ton of details, but it mentioned the basics. A single-bedroom cabin, a small kitchenette, a wood stove for heat, and an outhouse about 30 yards from the main building. No running water, just a pump outside. No electricity, which meant no lights once the sun went down. It was deep in the woods, miles from any paved roads. That's exactly what I wanted. The owner gave me the directions over email, telling me to leave the main road, follow a dirt path through the trees for about 6 miles, then look for a mailbox nailed to a pine tree with the number 407. The key would be under a loose brick by the steps. I packed light, a cooler full of food, a sleeping bag, a lantern, a couple of books, and a rifle just in case. I wasn't expecting trouble, but I figured it was better to have it and not need it. The drive out took longer than expected. The dirt road was rougher than I thought it would be, with deep ruts and sharp turns. I had to go slow to keep from wrecking my truck. The farther I went, the more I realized how alone I was. No houses, no signs, just trees pressing in on both sides. The only sound was the crunch of my tires over the gravel. It was late afternoon when I found the mailbox. Just a rusted metal box with the numbers faded almost to nothing. I pulled in, followed a narrow path through the trees, and finally saw the cabin. It was small, just a simple wooden structure with a slanted roof and a tiny porch. A fire pit sat a few feet away, surrounded by old logs. The place looked like it hadn't been used in a long time. The steps creaked when I walked up them, and when I grabbed the key from under the brick, I had to jiggle it in the lock to get the door open. Inside, it smelled like dust and old wood. The furniture was basic, a small bed, a table with 2 chairs, a counter with a few cabinets, and a wood stove in the corner. There was a single window looking out toward the trees, and a door leading to a storage area in the back. I set my things down, cracked open a beer, and sat on the porch to watch the sun go down. That's when I saw the dog. It stood just beyond the tree line, maybe 50 yards away. A big dog, dark-colored, sitting perfectly still in the fading light. I couldn't make out its features, but something about it seemed off. I whistled. No reaction, just those dark eyes watching me. I figured it was a stray or maybe a hunting dog that got lost. If it was still hanging around in the morning, I'd see if it had a collar. That night, I fell asleep to the sound of crickets and the occasional rustling in the trees. Normal forest noises, nothing out of the ordinary. But when I woke up to use the outhouse around 2 in the morning, I felt it before I saw it. That feeling of being watched. I stepped out onto the porch, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. The moon was bright, casting long shadows across the ground. And there, just at the edge of the trees, was the dog. Still sitting, still watching. It hadn't moved. I stared at it for a long time, waiting for it to do something. Wag its tail, shift its weight, anything. But it just sat there like a statue. I shook off the unease, walked to the outhouse, and did my business. When I came back, it was gone. The next morning, I half convinced myself I'd imagined it. Maybe my eyes had played tricks on me in the dark. I spent the day fishing at a small stream about a half-mile from the cabin. When I got back, I cleaned my catch, cooked a late lunch, and sat on the porch again. And there it was. Same spot, same distance, just sitting. I called out to it. Nothing. I tossed a piece of fish into the grass. No reaction. I stood up and took a step toward it. Stood up too. I stopped. It stopped. A cold feeling crawled up my spine. I took a slow step back onto the porch. Sat back down. I went inside. That night, I locked the door. Not that it would do much good. A determined animal could tear through the old wood without much trouble, but it made me feel better. At some point, I woke up to the sound of scratching. Not at the door, at the window. Slow, deliberate scratching. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. Just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening. It went on for what felt like hours. Then it stopped. I barely slept after that. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin, looking for tracks. The ground was dry and covered in pine needles, but near the window, I found them. Paw prints, but they weren't right. Too big. And the spacing was weird, like whatever left them had moved in a way that wasn't natural. I thought about leaving, packing up and getting the hell out of there. But I told myself I was being stupid. It was just a dog. A weird dog, yeah, but still just a dog. I spent the day hiking, trying to clear my head. By the time I got back, the sun was setting, and the dog was gone. I didn't see it that evening. Didn't see it when I went to bed. But around midnight, I woke up. Something was breathing outside the cabin. Not the soft, panting sound a dog makes. This was deep, heavy, right against the wall. I grabbed my rifle and sat up, heart hammering in my chest. The breathing moved, circling the cabin, slow and steady. I held my breath, waiting, then silence. The next morning, I made my decision. I packed my things, threw them in the truck, and got the hell out of there. As I drove down the dirt path, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The dog was standing in the middle of the road, watching me leave. I never looked back. The cabin looked even smaller in person than it had in the online listing. I sat in my car for a long moment, hands still on the steering wheel, staring at the dark wooden structure half hidden by the trees. It had seemed perfect when I booked it. A quiet, off-grid cabin deep in the woods, far from the noise of the city. A place to clear my head. Now, sitting there in the growing dusk, something about it made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way the trees loomed around it, dense and overgrown, or maybe it was just the weight of being so alone out here. I stepped out of the car, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots the only sound. The air was sharp and cool, carrying the damp scent of moss and pine. There was no cell service, which I'd known before coming, but it felt more real now that I was standing there, completely disconnected from the rest of the world. The cabin was simple: one room, a small kitchen, and a loft bed accessible by a wooden ladder. No electricity, just a wood-burning stove for heat. The windows were dusty, and the front porch sagged a little under my weight as I stepped up to the door. I fished the key from my pocket, unlocked it, and pushed inside. It smelled of old wood and dust, the kind of place that hadn't seen much use. There was a lantern on the small kitchen table, which I lit, casting a flickering glow against the walls. I moved around, setting down my bag, checking the cabinets. Empty except for a few mismatched dishes, and stacking the firewood I'd brought by the stove. The place was quiet, the silence almost too thick. I could hear my own breathing, the sound of my jacket shifting as I moved. Outside, the sun had almost disappeared, leaving only a thin line of light along the horizon. I stepped onto the porch, looking out at the tree line. The forest stretched in every direction, dense and unmoving. There was a clearing in front of the cabin, but beyond that, the trees closed in, dark and impenetrable. It felt like standing on the edge of something vast, like the forest could swallow me up if I wandered too far. I ate a quick dinner, heating up a can of soup on the stove. The wind had picked up outside, rattling the trees, making the cabin creak. I told myself it was just old wood settling, just the natural sounds of an old structure in the woods. But it still made my skin crawl. The night deepened, and the cabin felt smaller, the darkness pressing in from all sides. I climbed the ladder to the loft, my flashlight beam sweeping across the wooden planks. The bed was nothing more than a thin mattress on a frame, but it would do. I lay there for a long time, listening. I had just started to doze when something woke me, a sound. It wasn't the wind. It was slow, deliberate. Footsteps, not on the porch, not on the gravel drive, somewhere out in the trees. I held my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. The sound came again, closer this time. Leaves crunching, twigs snapping. Someone or something was moving just beyond the clearing. I reached for my flashlight, clicked it off, and lay perfectly still. My body felt cold, my skin tight with fear. I strained my ears, trying to pick apart the sounds from the wind. The footsteps were irregular, stopping and starting, like whoever it was didn't want to be heard. The sound moved around the cabin. Slow, deliberate. I wanted to convince myself it was an animal, but no animal moved like that. I had spent enough time in the woods to know the difference. This was something else. I lay there, every muscle locked, waiting. Then suddenly the sound stopped. Silence. Thick, unnatural. I waited for what felt like hours, my breath shallow, my body rigid. The wind had died down, and the only thing I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I must have dozed off, because when I woke again, It was still dark, but the fear had dulled to a heavy weight in my chest. I listened. The forest was quiet. No footsteps, no wind, just the deep stillness of the woods at night. I told myself I had imagined it, that I was just on edge from being alone, that I had let my mind play tricks on me. Morning came slow, the sky turning a pale gray before the sun finally crested the trees. I climbed down from the loft, my body stiff, my mind still clouded with unease. The first thing I did was step onto the porch, squinting against the early light, scanning the clearing. Everything looked normal. No signs of anything out of place. No tracks, no broken branches, just the same quiet, empty woods. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I had overreacted. I made coffee on the small propane stove I had brought, eating a granola bar as I sat on the porch. The unease lingered, but I forced myself to relax. The day passed slowly. I hiked a few miles, following an old trail that looped around a rocky ridge. The view was incredible, the forest stretching endlessly in every direction, untouched and wild. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was small things, the occasional rustling that didn't quite match the wind, the way the hairs on my neck stood up at random moments, like I was being watched. I told myself I was being paranoid, that my mind was still stuck on last night. But as I neared the cabin again, my stomach dropped. The door was open, not wide open, just slightly ajar. I was sure I had closed it. I had locked it. I stood there for a long moment, my pulse pounding. Then I stepped forward, slowly, carefully. The inside of the cabin looked the same. My bag was where I had left it. The lantern was still on the table. Nothing was missing. Nothing was moved. But the window over the sink was unlocked. I was certain I had locked it. I checked the rest of the cabin, every corner, every shadow. Nothing. No sign of anyone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside. I forced myself to stay calm, but I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things quickly, stuffing my gear into my bag, my hands shaking. I stepped onto the porch, glancing back one last time, and that's when I saw it. Across the clearing, at the edge of the trees, there was something hanging from a low branch. A rabbit, skinned, gutted, dangling by its hind legs, swaying slightly in the breeze. A warning. I didn't think. I just moved. I grabbed my bag, threw it in the car, and started the engine. Gravel sprayed as I turned onto the narrow road, my hands tight on the wheel, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. No one was there, but I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I drove until I reached the main road, until I had service again, until the cabin and the forest were nothing but a distant memory. I never reported it, never went back. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still hear those footsteps, still feel that weight in my chest, like something is just beyond the trees, watching, waiting, and I'll never know who or what it was. It started as a quiet weekend. I had been looking forward to getting away from everything. Just me, the trees, and the old hunting cabin my uncle left behind when he moved south. It wasn't much, just a single-room structure with a wood stove, a cot, and a little table pushed against the far wall. But it was enough for me. I got there late in the afternoon, the sky already starting to dim as I pulled my truck onto the narrow dirt path that led to the cabin. The drive had been longer than I expected, winding through miles of thick forest with no signs of life except for the occasional deer darting between the trees. By the time I parked and stepped out, the air had turned cold. The place looked the same as I remembered. The wood was dark from years of weather, the porch sagging slightly under its own weight. The forest pressed in close on all sides, tall pines stretching high above, their tips swaying slightly in the wind. It was quiet, unnaturally so. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the occasional creak of the trees shifting. I grabbed my bag and headed inside. The door stuck for a second before I had to shove it open, sending a small cloud of dust into the air. Inside, everything was the same. A few old hunting magazines stacked on the table, a rusted lantern hanging by the stove, and a pile of split firewood stacked neatly in the corner. The cot still had the same thin mattress on it, though it smelled a little more musty than I remembered. The first thing I did was get a fire going. The temperature was dropping fast, and I could already see my breath in the air. I knelt by the stove, stacking kindling and striking a match. The flame caught, flickering weakly at first before the wood finally took. As the fire crackled, I set up my things. I hadn't brought much, just some canned food, a thermos of coffee, and a flashlight in case the old generator decided to give out. I sat on the cot, sipping coffee and watching the fire glow against the walls. Outside, the wind picked up. It whistled through the trees, making the cabin creak softly. I wasn't nervous. I had spent enough nights here growing up to know the sounds of the woods. Still, something about the silence felt different. I shook it off. I was just tired. By the time I decided to get some rest, the fire had burned down to a low, steady glow. I crawled into the cot, pulling my jacket over me for extra warmth. It was around midnight when I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The fire was still smoldering, casting weak shadows against the walls. The wind outside had died down, leaving the cabin in complete silence. Then I heard it, a soft crunch. Footsteps, slow, careful. I held my breath. My mind raced. Asterisk a bear? A deer? Asterisk. Another crunch. Closer this time. I eased up slightly, trying to listen. Whatever it was moving deliberately. Not an animal stumbling through the brush. Each step was slow, purposeful. Then, just outside the cabin, the sound stopped. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The only sound was the soft crackling of the embers in the stove. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a branch fell. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I was just starting to relax when the doorknob moved. Not rattling, not shaking, just a slow, deliberate turn. I froze. The lock was old, but it still held. Whoever was outside tested it again, this time pressing against the wood. The door creaked slightly but didn't open. Then silence. I sat there, heart pounding. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Nothing. No movement. No retreating footsteps. Just that heavy silence pressing down on me. I waited, my eyes locked on the door, every muscle in my body tense. The fire had burned even lower now, casting long, twisting shadows across the walls. Finally, I moved. Slowly, carefully, I reached for the flashlight and flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on the door. It was shut, the latch still in place. I swallowed hard. I needed to check. Forcing myself to move, I slid out of the cot and stepped toward the window. I kept the flashlight low, angling it just enough to see outside. Nothing. The trees swayed gently in the dim moonlight, but the ground was empty. No footprints, no signs of movement. I exhaled slowly, trying to steady my breathing. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the wind had caught the door just right, making it shift. Still, I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I stepped outside, half expecting to see tracks in the dirt. But there was nothing. The ground was undisturbed. The only footprints were my own, leading from the truck to the cabin. I tried to brush it off. Maybe I was just on edge. The rest of the day was quiet. I spent the afternoon chopping some extra firewood and checking the cabin for any signs of animals getting in. I even walked a bit into the woods, following an old trail my uncle used to take when he went hunting. But the feeling never left. That night, I made sure the fire was bigger. I kept the flashlight within arm's reach, my boots near the bed in case I needed to move fast. At some point, I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was awake again. And the door was open. Not wide, just a crack. Just enough for the cold air to seep in. My stomach dropped. I had locked it. I knew I had. I sat up slowly, every hair on my body standing on end. The fire had burned low again, barely giving off any light. I reached for the flashlight with shaking hands, clicking it on. The beam swept across the room. Empty. I turned toward the door. The outside was nothing but darkness. I forced myself to move. Every step felt like I was walking through water. I reached the door and pressed it shut, sliding the latch back into place. I didn't sleep after that. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed quickly, stuffing everything into my bag and dousing the fire. As I stepped outside, the air felt heavier. The trees, the sky, everything felt off, like the forest itself was watching. Then I saw them. Footprints. Not mine. They started near the edge of the clearing and led straight to the cabin. Only one set. No retreating tracks. No sign of anyone leaving. Just a single set of footprints leading to my door. I didn't stay to figure it out. I got in my truck, started the engine, and didn't look back. Even now, I don't know what happened that night. I tell myself it was just some drifter passing through, someone looking for shelter. But if that were true, where did they go? I never really believed in the stories people told about the woods. The warnings about things you shouldn't look for, noises you shouldn't investigate, and places you shouldn't go never seemed like anything more than old folklore. But after what happened to me, I understand now that not everything in the woods is meant to be understood. It started when I rented a cabin deep in the northern woods. I had been going through a rough time, stress at work, trouble sleeping, the usual, and I wanted to get away from everything for a while. The cabin was isolated, miles from the nearest town, surrounded by dense forest. It was exactly what I wanted. Just peace, quiet, and nature. I arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees. The cabin was old but sturdy, a single-story structure with a wraparound porch and a stone chimney. The wood was dark from years of weather, but the place was in good shape. There was a fire pit outside, stacked with neatly cut logs, and a small clearing that stretched out before the forest swallowed everything else. Inside, the cabin was simple. A main living area with a fireplace and a couch, a tiny kitchen with outdated appliances, and a single bedroom with a bed that looked like it had been there for decades. The air smelled like dust and pine, and everything had a slight chill from being closed up. I dropped my bag, opened a few windows to let in fresh air, and went outside to take a look around. The woods were dense and quiet. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds. I had expected more noise, bugs, maybe a few animals, but it was strangely still. I walked a short distance from the cabin, just far enough to see the property's edge before the forest became too thick. There were no signs of anyone else. No old campsites, no garbage, no trails leading away. Just untouched wilderness. I made a fire that night, sitting outside as the sky turned dark. The stars were bright, sharper than they ever looked back home, and the air was cool but comfortable. It was exactly the kind of escape I had hoped for. Then I heard it. First, I thought it was the wind, a low, drawn-out howl that moved through the trees, shifting in pitch. But then it stopped, and for a few seconds there was nothing. No wind, no crickets, just silence. Then I heard it again, closer this time. It wasn't a coyote or a wolf. I had heard those before. This was different, deeper, stronger, like something bigger was out there. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a large dog that had wandered off from a farm. But something about it felt off. It wasn't just the sound, it was the way the night itself seemed to react to it. The way everything else went quiet when it called. I stayed outside a little longer, listening, but I didn't hear it again. I eventually convinced myself it was nothing and went inside, locking the door behind me. That night, I barely slept. Every time I drifted off, some small noise would pull me back. A creak from the porch, a rustle outside the window, the distant snap of a branch. At some point, I got up and looked out the window. The forest was still. Nothing moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. The next morning, I woke up early and stepped outside, hoping the sunlight would make me feel a little less paranoid. The fire pit was nothing but embers, and the air was crisp. But as I looked toward the edge of the clearing, my stomach dropped. Tracks. They weren't boot prints or deer tracks. They were large, too large for a normal animal. The shape was strange, like a canine print, but stretched, almost as if the foot was too long. And there were claw marks, deep in the dirt. I followed them for a few feet before they disappeared into the woods. My gut told me to stop, to turn back, but my curiosity got the better of me. I took a few steps into the trees, moving carefully, trying not to make a sound. The forest felt different, like the air itself had thickened, pressing in around me. The silence was overwhelming. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just my own breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. Then I saw something ahead. A tree, its bark torn apart. Deep scratches carved into the wood as if something massive had raked its claws down its side. The marks were fresh, the exposed wood still raw and pale. I backed away, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Whatever made those marks wasn't just passing through. It was hunting. That night I stayed inside. I kept the fireplace going, the warmth making me feel a little safer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Around midnight, I heard something outside. A heavy, deliberate step, then another. It wasn't the light movement of a deer or the cautious steps of a fox. This was something big, something that wasn't trying to be quiet. I stood by the window, barely breathing, my fingers gripping the windowsill. Then I saw them, eyes low to the ground at first, just beyond the firelight. They reflected the flames, two pale orbs watching, unblinking. Then they rose. Whatever it wasn't on all fours. It had stood up, couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The thing just stood there, staring. Then slowly it stepped forward. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and flicked it on, aiming it toward the trees. It was gone, but I knew it was still there. I shut and locked every door and window, making sure the cabin was sealed. Then I sat by the fireplace, my back against the wall, listening. For hours I listened. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, it was morning. I stepped outside carefully, scanning the tree line. The tracks were back. Deep impressions in the dirt, circling the cabin. It had been watching me all night. I packed my things immediately. I didn't care about my planned week-long stay. I wasn't staying another night. As I loaded my truck, I felt it again. That feeling of being watched. I forced myself not to look toward the trees. As I turned the key in the ignition, something moved at the edge of the clearing. Tall, dark, standing just inside the tree line. I didn't wait. I didn't breathe. I slammed the truck into gear and tore down the dirt road, gravel kicking up behind me. I didn't stop until I was miles away, until I saw the first signs of civilization again. I never went back. I never told anyone the full story, but I know what I saw, and I know it's still out there. I don't know how to explain what I saw, and I don't expect anyone to believe me. If I hadn't been there, if I hadn't felt the way the air changed, smelled what I smelled, or seen what I saw, I wouldn't believe it either. But I did. And I don't think I'll ever go back to that place again. It started with a simple idea. Getting away from everything. Work had been grinding me down for months, and I was tired of people, traffic, noise, just life in general. I wanted space, silence, time to myself. So I found a cabin. It was an old hunting cabin deep in the woods of northern Michigan, miles from the nearest town. The listing called it rustic, which was a polite way of saying rundown. But I didn't care. I wasn't looking for comfort. I was looking for solitude. I wanted to sit by a fire, drink some coffee, maybe hike a little, clear my head. The drive out there was uneventful. The last 30 miles were nothing but dirt roads, winding through dense forest. Towering pines and thick undergrowth closed in on both sides, making the road feel narrower than it was. There were no streetlights, no houses, just an endless stretch of trees. The deeper I went, the more I felt the weight of civilization falling away. It was exactly what I wanted. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already low in the sky. It was smaller than I expected, with a slanted metal roof and dark wooden walls that looked like they hadn't been stained in decades. A stone chimney jutted out the side, and a wraparound porch sagged under years of neglect. There was no driveway, just a clearing in the trees where I parked my truck. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not just the absence of people, but the absence of everything. No birds, no rustling leaves, no distant hum of insects. Just the wind, slow and steady, moving through the trees. It wasn't peaceful. It was unnatural. I tried to shake the feeling and got to work unloading my gear. The cabin had no electricity, just a wood stove for heat and an old propane lantern on the table. I set my sleeping bag on the narrow cot in the corner, lit a fire in the stove, and settled in for the night. The first few hours were uneventful. I sat on the porch, drank a beer, watched the fireflies blink between the trees. The quiet still bothered me, but I told myself it was just my imagination. The wind picked up as the night went on, making the trees sway and creak. I went to bed around 11, but I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, feeling like something was off, though I couldn't say what. At some point, I realized I wasn't hearing the wind anymore. The air was still heavy. The only sound was my own breathing. Then I heard it, a deep, guttural huff. Not close, but not far either. Somewhere in the trees. I sat up, heart pounding, ears straining. It came again. Slow, steady breathing, like something big was standing just beyond the tree line. I've heard deer before, even bears. This was different. It was deliberate, too measured for a wild animal. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it out the window. Nothing, just darkness and the vague outlines of trees. I told myself it was a buck, maybe a big one, snorting in the cold night air. But I didn't really believe that. I lay back down, listening. The breathing had stopped, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. Morning came cold and gray. I stepped outside to start a fire in the fire pit and stopped dead in my tracks. There were footprints in the dirt. Not boots, not hooves. Asterisk, asterisk, footprints, asterisk, asterisk. Huge, clawed prints, pressed deep into the damp earth, circling the cabin. I felt my stomach drop. They were too big to be a wolf's, too wide for a bear's. And they weren't padded like a dog's. They had toes, long and spindly, tipped with sharp claws that had raked the soil. I followed the prints around the cabin. They came from the trees, stopped near the porch, then moved along the side of the building before disappearing into the woods. Whatever made them had been watching me. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Maybe it was a hoax. Maybe some local kids were messing with me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The prints were too deep, too deliberate. I needed to get out of there. I should have left. I should have packed my gear, gotten in my truck, and never looked back. But I didn't. I told myself I was overreacting. There had to be a logical explanation. I spent the day hiking, trying to clear my head, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every so often, I'd catch movement in the trees, just a flicker, something dark slipping between the branches. Every time I turned to look, it was gone. That night, I locked the cabin door and kept my rifle close. The wind picked up again, howling through the trees. I told myself the tracks were gone, the noises were nothing, and that I'd leave in the morning. Then, around midnight, I heard it again. The breathing, but this time it was closer, right outside the window. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just listened as it exhaled, slow and heavy, fogging up the glass. Then something scraped against the wood. Long, deliberate strokes like claws dragging across the cabin wall. I gripped my rifle and pointed it at the window, heart hammering. The breathing stopped. The scraping stopped. For a long time, there was nothing. Then, just as I thought it was gone, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A low, rumbling growl. Deep, guttural, too big to be anything I'd ever heard before. Then the doorknob rattled. I fired. The gunshot exploded through the cabin, deafening in the tight space. I heard a snarl, something huge slamming against the wall. Then silence. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the corner, rifle in my lap, waiting for sunrise. When daylight finally came, I stepped outside. My truck was wrecked. The doors were scratched to hell, deep gouges raked across the metal. I didn't hesitate. I threw my gear in the back and tore out of there, not stopping until I reached the main road. I never went back. I never told anyone what happened, but sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still hear that breathing, and I know it's still out there. I took the weekend off to clear my head. The city had been draining me, and the thought of silence, real silence, not the kind interrupted by car horns or the hum of a refrigerator, was too tempting to resist. I rented a small cabin deep in the woods, miles from the nearest paved road. It was a simple place, one of those old log structures built decades ago by someone looking for solitude. No electricity, no running water, just a wood-burning stove, an old hand pump for well water, and a lantern hanging by the front door. It was exactly what I needed. The drive in took longer than expected. The gravel road twisted through thick trees, some areas barely wide enough for my truck to squeeze through. I hadn't seen another car for over an hour. No cell service either. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin sat, the sun was dipping behind the trees, the sky a soft shade of orange. The place was smaller than I expected, tucked against the edge of the forest with a fire pit out front and a narrow trail leading down to a creek. I parked beside the cabin and stepped out, stretching my legs. The air smelled different here, clean, like damp earth and pine. The quiet was absolute. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, just the rustle of wind through the trees and the occasional chirp of a bird. I unlocked the cabin and stepped inside. It was basic but sturdy. Rough wooden floors, a small table with 2 chairs, a cot pushed against one wall, and shelves lined with old tin cans and a few mismatched plates. A cast iron stove sat in the corner, cold and covered in a fine layer of dust. I set my bag down and took a deep breath. The first night was uneventful. I made a small fire in the stove, warmed up a can of chili, and sat outside for a while watching the stars. It had been a long time since I'd seen them this clearly. With no city lights, the sky looked endless, packed with thousands of pinpricks of white. I stayed out until the cold got to me, then crawled into the cot inside, listening to the distant hoot of an owl as I drifted off. I woke up to something moving outside. A rustling sound, slow and deliberate, like footsteps through dry leaves. I held still, my breath caught in my throat, listening. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint orange light across the walls. The sound came again, closer this time. Not the skittering of an animal, something heavier. I slowly sat up, my ears straining. The cabin had a single window beside the door, covered by an old curtain. I considered looking outside but hesitated. Instead, I reached for the flashlight I'd packed and flicked it on, shining it toward the door. Silence. The movement had stopped. I waited, heart pounding, before finally convincing myself it had been nothing. Maybe a deer passing through, stepping on a dry branch. After a few more minutes, I forced myself to lie back down, though it took a long time for sleep to return. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. The ground was covered in a thick layer of leaves, but I found disturbances, scattered patches where something had moved through. I bent down, brushing aside the leaves, and found a footprint. Not a boot print, a bare foot pressed deep into the earth. I stared at it, my stomach twisting. It was human, definitely, but something about it was wrong. The toes looked too long, the arch too high. The print was fresh, made sometime during the night. I stood up, scanning the trees. Nothing, just thick trunks and shadows stretching between them. I told myself it had to be a trick of the light, maybe some animal track that only looked human. Still, an unease settled into my chest. I spent the day exploring, trying to shake off the feeling. I followed the creek for a while, watching the water bubble over smooth stones, then hiked up a ridge behind the cabin, where I could see for miles. Nothing but trees in every direction. No houses, no roads. That night, I triple-checked the lock on the door before climbing into bed. The wind had picked up, rattling the branches outside. I listened for a long time, but nothing came. Eventually, sleep took me. Then, sometime in the dead of night, I woke up again. This time, it was different. The air felt wrong, thicker, heavier. The fire had burned out completely, leaving the cabin in near total darkness. And then I heard it. breathing, slow, deep breaths, just outside the window. I didn't move. I barely even blinked. The sound was close, so close I could almost feel the warmth of it against the thin walls of the cabin. It wasn't hurried or erratic, just slow, steady inhales and exhales. I gripped the flashlight but didn't turn it on. Something told me I didn't want to see what was out there. The breathing continued for what felt like forever. Then slowly it faded. Not all at once, but gradually, like whoever or whatever it was had started walking away. I lay there for hours, wide awake, every muscle in my body rigid. When dawn finally came, I forced myself to go outside. The forest was quiet, the air crisp with morning chill. I walked around the cabin, stopping near the window. There, in the dirt, was another footprint. This time, it was right up against the cabin wall, right beneath where my head had been as I slept. I packed my things immediately, threw everything into my truck without bothering to organize. I didn't care. I didn't bother checking the road as I peeled out, gravel spitting from my tires. I just drove, barely slowing as I navigated the narrow turns back towards civilization. Hours later, when I finally reached a gas station with service, I pulled out my phone. I debated calling the authorities, but what could I say? That I heard something breathing outside my cabin? That I found strange footprints? It wasn't a crime to walk through the woods barefoot. I sat there for a long time, staring out at the road, my hands still shaking. I never went back, never even tried to get a refund for the remaining nights. Some things aren't worth understanding. The cabin was supposed to be an escape. Just me, the woods, and the quiet. I'd been working nonstop for months, and when my uncle offered to let me stay at his old hunting cabin for a week, I didn't even think twice. It was a small place, nothing fancy, but it was deep in the woods, tucked away from the world. No cell service, no internet, just a radio and an old landline in case of emergencies. The drive up was long. The last few miles, nothing but dirt road winding through thick trees. It felt like I was leaving everything behind, which was exactly what I wanted. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were birds and the occasional rustling in the brush. I pulled up just before sunset, parking my truck in the clearing beside the cabin. It was smaller than I remembered, just a single room with a loft, a tiny kitchen, and a wood stove. The porch wrapped around the front, overlooking a fire pit and a view of the thick forest stretching out below. The first night was peaceful. I made a fire, cooked some canned chili, and sat outside with a beer, listening to the sounds of the woods. It got cold fast, so I headed inside, locking the door and bolting the windows just in case. I wasn't really worried about people out here, just animals. I climbed up to the loft, lay down in the creaky old bed, and let the quiet pull me under. I woke up around 3 a.m., not sure why. The room was pitch black, the kind of darkness you only get deep in the woods, where there's no street lights or passing cars. I listened for a minute, heart pounding a little, but all I could hear was the wind outside, probably just the old cabin settling. I rolled over and went back to sleep. The next morning, I found something weird. Near the fire pit, there were footprints, bare feet pressed deep into the dirt. They weren't mine. I had worn boots the entire time. The prints were fresh, leading from the tree-line, circling the fire pit once, then back into the woods. I tried to make sense of it. Maybe some hiker got lost and wandered through, but who hikes barefoot out here? And why would they come right up to the cabin? I felt a chill run down my spine, but I pushed it away. Maybe I had missed them the night before. I shook it off, spent the day hiking a few miles out, taking in the quiet, the solitude. When I got back, I chopped some wood, made another fire, and cooked dinner. By the time the sun set, I'd convinced myself the footprints didn't mean anything. That night, I woke up again. This time, I heard something. A creaking noise, like wood shifting under weight. My stomach clenched as I listened, barely breathing. Came again, slow, deliberate. The sound of footsteps on the porch. I sat up, heart hammering. The shotgun was downstairs, leaned up against the wall by the door. I hadn't thought I'd need it, but now I wished I'd kept it closer. The footsteps stopped. The cabin was dead silent, but I could feel something, someone, out there. I didn't move. I just sat, straining to hear. After what felt like forever, I forced myself to climb down from the loft as quietly as I could. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and I froze. Still nothing. I grabbed the shotgun, checked the chamber, loaded. I stood there, gripping it tight, waiting. I wanted to turn on the porch light, but that meant opening the door. I wasn't ready for that. Instead, I stood by the window, peeking out from the side, trying to see anything in the dark. Nothing. I stayed up the rest of the night, listening. By morning, I felt stupid. Probably just an animal. Maybe a raccoon or a stray dog. I forced myself to believe it, but I couldn't ignore the footprints. They were back. This time, they went all the way up to the door. I packed my things. Maybe I was being paranoid, but I didn't care. I wasn't spending another night here. I locked up, loaded my truck, and turned the key. Nothing. The engine didn't even try to turn over. I checked everything. The battery was fine, fuel was good. I tried again. Nothing. A bad feeling settled in my stomach. I grabbed my phone, already knowing what I'd see. No signal. The only way out was on foot. The nearest road was about 5 miles away. I could hike out, find someone to help. I grabbed my backpack, packed water and a flashlight, took the shotgun and set out. The woods felt different. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy, pressing in on me. I kept looking over my shoulder, my pace quickening. 2 miles in, I found something that made my stomach drop. A small clearing with a pile of old blankets, a plastic tarp stretched between trees, trash scattered around, empty cans, a rusted knife, a pair of filthy shoes. Someone was living out here, and they had been watching me. I turned and ran. I don't know how long I ran, but by the time I stopped, I was drenched in sweat, my breath ragged. I forced myself to listen. The woods were quiet, too quiet. Then I heard it, a branch snapping, not far. I gripped the shotgun, scanning the trees. Nothing. Then just ahead, a figure. Thin, ragged clothes, long greasy hair, barefoot, standing still, watching me. I raised the shotgun. "Go!" I shouted. My voice felt too loud, out of place in the dead silence. The man didn't move. Then he smiled. I didn't wait. I fired a warning shot into the ground. The blast echoed through the trees, birds scattering. The man flinched but didn't run. He just tilted his head, grinning. I took a step back, then another. I didn't take my eyes off him as I turned and started moving fast, half walking, half jogging. I could hear him behind me, keeping pace, not running, just following. I pushed forward, my legs burning, my lungs screaming. The road had to be close. Then finally, gravel. I stumbled out onto the road, turning in both directions. Empty. No cars, no signs of life. I looked back. He was gone. I didn't stop. I kept moving down the road, shotgun still in my hands. After about half a mile, I saw it, a truck. I ran straight into the road, waving my arms. The driver slammed the brakes, staring at me like I was crazy. I didn't care. I told him everything. He let me in, drove me straight to town. I called the police. They went back to the cabin, searched the woods. They never found him. They found his camp, though. Old clothes, rotting food, a pile of bones, small ones. Animal, probably, and a notebook, pages filled with scribbled writing. My name was in it, over and over. I never went back. The cabin still stands, empty. But sometimes, when my uncle checks on it, he finds footprints, bare feet, circling the fire pit, waiting. I don't know why I agreed to it. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't the type to get scared easily. Maybe I just wanted a weekend to get away from everything. Either way, I found myself driving down a long, winding road toward a cabin deep in the woods of Devil's Hollow. The place had a reputation. I had heard the stories growing up. Missing hunters, strange noises in the woods, abandoned campsites left untouched for years. But I wasn't one to believe in rumors. I figured most of it was just talk, exaggerated over time, like all small-town legends. The drive was longer than I expected. The further I went, the worse the road got. The asphalt cracked and crumbled into loose gravel, and soon it was just dirt with deep ruts that made my tires skid. The trees pressed in closer, their branches twisting overhead like gnarled fingers. I checked the map on my phone. No signal. Figures. I kept driving, gripping the wheel tightly as the road narrowed. My headlights barely cut through the thick mist hanging in the trees. The sun had already dipped below the hills, and shadows stretched long and deep across the ground. I almost missed the turn. The sign for the cabin was barely visible, a worn wooden post half sunk into the dirt. The words "Dear Hollow Cabin" were carved into it, but the letters were faded, nearly swallowed by time. I turned onto the smaller path, my tires crunching over twigs and dead leaves. The road here was worse, more like an overgrown trail than anything meant for cars. Branches scraped against my windows, and at one point, I thought I heard something rustle in the brush. But when I looked, there was nothing there. Then, through the trees, I saw it. The cabin. It was smaller than I expected. A simple one-story structure with a slanted tin roof and a small porch sagging under years of neglect. The windows were dark. The door looked solid, but the wood was aged and cracked. A stack of firewood sat to the side, damp from recent rain. I parked my car in the clearing and stepped out. The air was still, too still. No birds, no wind, just silence. I grabbed my bag and headed up the porch steps. The wood creaked beneath my weight. The key was exactly where it was supposed to be, under a loose stone near the door. I unlocked the cabin and stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and dust. The place was simple, a single room with a small kitchen, a fireplace, and a cot against the far wall. A wooden table sat in the center, one chair slightly pulled out like someone had left in a hurry. There were shelves lined with canned food, most of it probably expired. A hunting rifle leaned against the wall near the door. I dropped my bag on the cot and lit the lantern sitting on the table. The flame flickered weakly before catching, casting long, shifting shadows across the walls. I locked the door behind me. I told myself I wasn't scared. That first night, I barely slept. Not because of the cabin itself, but because of the noises outside. First, it was nothing. Just the normal sounds of the woods. Crickets, the occasional owl, branches shifting in the wind. But then, around midnight, the sounds changed. I heard something moving. It was slow, deliberate, not the quick, skittering movement of a raccoon or a fox. Something bigger, heavier. I sat up in my cot, holding my breath. The sound stopped. I waited. Nothing. I lay back down, but I didn't close my eyes. A few minutes later, I heard it again. Closer this time. The crunch of leaves. The snap of a twig. Then silence. I wanted to look out the window, but something in me told me not to. Instead, I reached for the hunting rifle by the door. It wasn't loaded. I knew that, but holding it made me feel better. I sat there, listening. The sound didn't come back. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into uneasy sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside to check the area. The ground was damp from the night's dew, but near the porch, I saw something that made my stomach twist. Footprints, not boot prints, bare feet, and they weren't mine. They led from the edge of the trees, stopped just before the porch, then turned back into the woods. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Maybe a drifter? Someone living out here in the woods? But who walks barefoot through the forest in the middle of the night? I shook off the unease and spent most of the day gathering firewood. I kept my rifle close. By the time the sun set, I was exhausted. I told myself that whatever happened last night was a one-time thing. Maybe my mind had exaggerated it. Maybe the footprints were old, and I just hadn't noticed them before. I locked the door. I bolted the windows. I tried to sleep. I woke up to the sound of breathing. It was faint but close. Too close. I froze. Then I heard it, soft, deliberate footsteps on the porch. Slow, pausing between each step. I gripped the rifle tightly, then scraping, something against the door, a slow, dragging sound. I sat up, heart hammering. The door handle rattled. Someone was trying to get in. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then silence. I waited. Minutes passed. Then footsteps, moving away, back into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At dawn, I packed my things. I wasn't staying another night. I stepped outside, and my stomach dropped. The footprints were back. More of them, circling the cabin. And something else, carved into the porch railing in jagged, uneven letters. Come back. I left, drove faster than I ever had, the trees blurring past me. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main road. I never went back. I don't know who or what was out there, but I know this, I wasn't alone. The cabin sat deep in the forest, miles from the nearest road. It wasn't mine. I had rented it for a long weekend, just wanting some time away from everything. Work had been stressful, and I needed a break from people. I had no plans other than sitting by the fire, hiking a little, and maybe fishing in the small lake a mile downhill. The drive up was rough. The road turned from pavement to gravel, then from gravel to dirt, winding up through thick trees. My truck bounced over potholes, kicking up dust. By the time I arrived, it was almost evening, the sky dimming behind the trees. The cabin was small, just one story with a slanted roof, made of old wood that had gone gray with age. A porch wrapped around the front, with a single rocking chair and an old cooler sitting beside the door. I parked, got out and stretched. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. The woods were silent except for the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. No birds, no insects, just stillness. It was unsettling, but I told myself it was just because I wasn't used to being this deep in the woods alone. Inside, the cabin was simple. A small kitchen, a living room with a stone fireplace, and a bedroom in the back. The furniture was old but solid. The floor creaked under my boots as I carried in my bags. I had brought enough food for the weekend, along with a few books and a flashlight, just in case the power went out. The first night was uneventful. I made a fire, cooked some canned soup, and sat on the couch, watching the flames flicker. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows. Around midnight, I turned in, crawling into the old bed. The mattress was stiff, and the blankets smelled like dust, but I was too tired to care. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. Something had pulled me from sleep, but I didn't know what. I lay there, staring at the dark ceiling, listening. The wind had died down, and the forest was quiet again. Too quiet. Then I heard it. A sound outside, just beyond the walls. It wasn't the wind or a falling branch. It was movement. Slow, deliberate. Something was walking through the woods behind the cabin. I held my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps were soft, crunching over the dead leaves. Not an animal. Too slow for a deer, too heavy for a raccoon. My mind raced. A bear? Person? I sat up, my heart pounding. The sound stopped. For a long time, I sat there in the dark, listening. Nothing. Just silence. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing. The woods play tricks on your mind. Maybe a branch fell. Maybe it was just my imagination. I forced myself to lie back down, but it took a long time to fall asleep. The next morning, I stepped outside to check around the cabin. The air was crisp, the ground damp from the night's dew. I walked around to the back, and that's when I saw them. Footprints, not boot prints, bare feet. They were pressed into the soft earth just a few feet from the cabin wall. Long, narrow, spaced too far apart to be a child's. They led from the trees toward the cabin, stopping just beneath my bedroom window. I swallowed hard. Someone had been out here last night, standing right outside my window, watching. I felt exposed, like the trees were hiding someone just out of sight. I scanned the woods, but they were still and empty. I tried to tell myself it was an old set of prints, but they were fresh. The edges were sharp, undisturbed by wind or rain. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. I stayed close to the cabin that day. I had planned to hike down to the lake, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept checking the tree line, expecting to see someone standing there, watching. As the day dragged on, I forced myself to go outside, at least to gather some firewood. The pile beside the cabin was running low, and I needed more for the night. I grabbed my hatchet and walked a little way into the woods, searching for dry branches. The trees were thick here, the ground uneven. I kept glancing over my shoulder, listening for movement. Then I heard it. Not footsteps, breathing. Somewhere behind me, just beyond the trees. Slow, steady, deliberate. My body went cold. I turned, scanning the woods, but I saw nothing. I stood frozen for a long time, barely breathing myself. The air was thick, heavy. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the breathing stopped. I dropped the wood I had gathered and walked quickly back to the cabin, locking the door behind me. That night, I built the fire high, keeping the room warm and bright. I kept my flashlight beside me, my hatchet within reach. I barely slept. By the third day, I knew I needed to leave. I had barely stepped outside since the night I found the footprints. Every noise made me jump. The woods no longer felt peaceful, they felt like a trap. I packed my things that morning, stuffing everything back into my bag. I planned to leave by noon, but something inside me kept hesitating. I didn't want to go into the woods alone. The truck was parked 50 feet away, just beyond the trees. Should have been easy, but something was out there. I knew it. Finally, I told myself to stop being stupid. I shouldered my bag, grabbed my keys, and stepped outside. The forest was silent. No birds, no wind. I forced myself to walk toward the truck. Each step felt like it took forever. My skin crawled, my stomach tight. I reached the truck and yanked the door open. That's when I saw them. Footprints, bare feet, right beside my driver's side door. Someone had stood there, waiting. My hands shook as I climbed in, locking the doors. I turned the key and the engine roared to life. Relief flooded me until I looked up. In the rearview mirror, deep in the woods, something moved. A figure, too far to make out details, but close enough to see that it was watching me. Not moving, just standing there. I didn't wait. I threw the truck into reverse, kicking up dirt as I sped back down the road, not stopping, not looking back. It took me nearly an hour to reach the main road. I didn't breathe easy until I saw pavement again. I never went back for my deposit. Never told anyone what happened. The cabin is still there, deep in the woods, waiting. The first time I saw the cabin, it looked almost perfect. It was a two-story wooden structure sitting in the middle of a clearing, surrounded on all sides by dense forest. The trees stretched high, their tops swaying slightly even though I couldn't feel the wind down on the ground. The cabin itself was old but sturdy, with a steep roof and a covered porch that wrapped around the front. It wasn't fancy, but it looked solid, like the kind of place where you could spend a quiet weekend away from everything. I had rented it for a week, needing some time alone. Life in the city had been wearing me down, and I figured a week in the middle of nowhere would help clear my head. No phone service, no internet, just me, the trees, and maybe a few deer wandering past. The nearest town was a good 45-minute drive away, which meant I wouldn't be seeing anyone unless I needed supplies. That was exactly what I wanted. I got there late in the afternoon, the sun already starting to dip behind the trees. The dirt road leading up to the cabin had been rough, uneven, full of deep potholes and scattered branches, but my old SUV had handled it well enough. I parked next to the porch, stepped out, and took a deep breath. The air smelled clean, crisp, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. The key was under a rock near the front door, just like the owner had told me. I unlocked the door, pushed it open, and stepped inside. The air was stale, like it hadn't been opened in weeks, but otherwise the place was fine. A single large room on the first floor, with a wood-burning stove in the corner, a small kitchen area, and a set of stairs leading up to a loft where the bed was. Simple, functional. I walked through the cabin, checking everything out. The furniture was old but sturdy. A couch, a wooden table with two chairs, a shelf lined with a few dusty books. The kitchen had a small fridge, a propane stove, and some cabinets stocked with canned food. Enough to get by if I didn't want to make the trip back into town. Up in the loft, there was a single bed with a thick wool blanket and a window that overlooked the trees. The glass was a little dirty, but I could still see the dense forest stretching in every direction. No neighbors, no roads, just trees as far as I could see. That was when I heard it, a single thump coming from outside. I froze, listening. The sound had been deep, solid, like something heavy hitting wood. Maybe an animal knocking over a loose board on the porch? I waited, ears straining, but there was nothing. Just the soft whisper of the wind moving through the trees. I shook it off and went back downstairs. There was nothing out there. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. I spent the rest of the evening getting settled in. I unpacked my bags, made a quick meal, and lit a fire in the stove to keep the cabin warm. The sun had set by the time I finished eating, and without much else to do, I decided to call it a night. I climbed up to the loft, stretched out on the bed, and listened to the quiet. No traffic, no city noise, just the occasional creak of the cabin settling and the wind moving through the trees outside. Then, just as I was about to drift off, I heard it again. A deep, heavy thump. This time it was closer. I sat up, heart pounding. The sound had come from the front porch. I was sure of it. I waited, holding my breath. Nothing. Slowly, I climbed out of bed and moved to the window. I pressed my face to the glass, peering out into the darkness. The moon was bright enough to cast long shadows, but I didn't see anything moving. The porch was empty. The dirt road leading up to the cabin was empty. Just trees and shadows. I told myself it was probably a branch falling. Maybe a raccoon knocking something over. But something about it didn't sit right with me. I lay back down, listening. An hour passed, then another. Then, around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, right outside the cabin. My entire body went cold. I held my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps were light, careful, moving along the side of the cabin. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. They weren't lost. They were moving with purpose. I didn't move. I barely even breathed. The footsteps circled the cabin once, then stopped. Silence. The only sound was the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, waiting, listening, but there was nothing else. No more footsteps, no movement. At some point, I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, the sun was streaming through the window and the forest outside was bright and quiet. I forced myself to get up, still feeling shaken. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just an animal. But when I stepped outside, I saw them. Footprints. Not animal tracks. Not boots. Bare feet. Leading in a slow circle around the cabin. The breath left my lungs. I followed the prints, my skin crawling. They started at the tree line, circled the cabin, then led back into the woods. No sign of where they had come from. No sign of who had made them. I stood there for a long time, staring at the tracks, feeling something cold settle deep in my stomach. I wasn't alone out here, and whoever had been outside my cabin last night, they weren't wearing shoes. I spent the rest of the morning on edge. I checked the doors, the windows, made sure everything was locked. I didn't see anything else out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. By noon, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I grabbed my bags, threw them into the SUV, and turned the key in the ignition. The engine rumbled to life, and I felt a wave of relief until I looked up. At the edge of the trees, just where the footprints disappeared, someone was standing there. I didn't see their face. I didn't want to. I threw the car into reverse, backed up onto the dirt road, and got out of there as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. I never went back. A few weeks later, I got an email from the owner of the cabin, asking why I had left early. I never answered, because no matter how many times I tried to explain it to myself, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone in those woods, and I never wanted to find out who else was out there. I rented the cabin because I needed to get away. Work had been draining me. City noise never seemed to stop, and I just wanted silence. No emails, no car horns, no neighbors stomping above me. Just woods, a lake, and a few days of solitude. The place I found was about an hour outside of town, deep in the forest, far from any other homes or roads. It was a simple one-story log cabin with a covered porch and a view of the lake through the trees. The owner had told me it was used mostly in the summer by fishermen, but now, in late fall, it was empty. Perfect. I arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sun was setting. The drive had been long. The last few miles nothing but a dirt road winding through thick trees. By the time I parked and got out, the air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional distant bird call. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and took it all in. A single large room with a fireplace, a couch, a small kitchen, and a bed against the far wall. Rustic but clean. A few old fishing magazines were stacked on a wooden table. The fridge hummed softly, stocked with the groceries I had brought. No TV, no Wi-Fi, just what I wanted. After unpacking, I sat on the porch with a beer, watching the light fade from the sky. The lake was just beyond the trees, its surface smooth and dark. Everything felt still, peaceful. I hadn't felt that in a long time. Then I saw the dog. It stood at the tree line, just at the edge of the clearing where the cabin sat. A big, shaggy thing, dark-colored, maybe black or brown. It was hard to tell in the fading light. It didn't move, just stood there, watching. At first, I figured it was a stray or maybe belonged to a nearby property. But there weren't supposed to be any houses around here. I hadn't seen any on the drive-in. I watched it for a while, expecting it to lose interest and wander off. Didn't. It just stood there, staring. I finally got up and went inside. I wasn't about to spend my evening worrying about some random dog. Maybe it would be gone by morning. The next day was cold and overcast. I made coffee, stepped onto the porch and stretched. The air smelled like damp leaves, and a layer of mist clung to the trees. The dog was still there. Same spot, same posture. Just standing at the edge of the clearing, watching the cabin. I frowned. It hadn't moved all night? That didn't make sense. Maybe it had come and gone. But why come back? Was it hungry? Sick? I went inside, found a leftover sandwich from the night before, and stepped back out. I whistled and held out the sandwich. No reaction. It didn't move, didn't even twitch. I tossed the sandwich halfway between us. It landed in the grass. The dog didn't even glance at it. That was weird. I watched it a little longer, but it just stood there. After a while, I went back inside. The next couple of days were the same. Every morning, every evening, the dog was there. It never came closer, never moved when I was watching. Just stood at the tree line, staring. I started feeling uneasy. The whole point of coming out here was to be alone. But now I felt like I wasn't. That thing was always there, always watching. I told myself it was just a dog, maybe feral, maybe lost. But something about it made my skin crawl. I tried ignoring it. I spent my days reading, hiking, fishing by the lake. But every time I looked up, there it was. By the fourth night, I was done. I decided if the dog was still there in the morning, I'd leave early. Cut my trip short. It wasn't worth the weird feeling gnawing at me. I went to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. The cabin was silent except for the occasional creak of the wood settling. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to push the image of that damn dog out of my mind. Then I heard something. Not loud, just a soft, rhythmic sound outside. Breathing, deep, steady, just beyond the window. I didn't move. I just lay there, frozen, listening. The sound didn't stop. It wasn't wind, wasn't an animal rustling through the underbrush. It was breathing, slow and deliberate. I turned my head just enough to look toward the window. The dog was there, right outside the glass, staring in. Its eyes weren't glowing or anything dramatic like that, just dark and empty. The way it looked at me, there was nothing in its expression. No curiosity, no aggression, just blank watching. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Minutes passed. The breathing stayed steady. I could hear my own heartbeat hammering in my ears. Then, just as slowly as it had come, it backed away. Not turned, not walked, just stepped backward, one slow movement at a time, until it faded into the darkness. I didn't sleep after that. At dawn, I packed my things. I didn't even make coffee, didn't bother with breakfast. I just threw everything in the car and got the hell out. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The dog was standing in the middle of the clearing, watching me leave. It didn't follow, didn't move, just stood there watching. I didn't stop, didn't slow down. I didn't relax until I was miles away, back on the highway, with trees shrinking in my rearview. I never found out what was wrong with that dog. I don't think I want to.